The print is not large. It lies in red stone, pressed between ripple marks and the thin cracks of dried mud, a three-toed shape made by an animal that crossed a Triassic floodplain before there were flowers, before grass, before the continents had broken apart into the world you know. The toes point forward. The heel is narrow. The stride is light. Whoever made it was not a giant yet. It was moving through a world where dinosaurs existed, but did not yet command the land. Around the track, the rock still holds the memory of water. A river had spread across the plain and then retreated under heat. Silt settled. Mud tightened. A foot came down at the right moment, soft enough to receive the animal, firm enough to keep the outline. Then, another flood buried the surface, sealing the mark away, while Pangaea continued to breathe under a hot Triassic sky. The story of the Triassic Takeover begins with traces like this. Not with the huge skeletons that fill museum halls, and not with the famous giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, but with smaller animals moving through landscapes that were already crowded with competitors. Early dinosaurs were fast, upright, and adaptable, but for much of the Triassic, they were only one part of a much larger reptile world. The Triassic period lasted from about 252 million years ago to about 201 million years ago. It was the first chapter of the Mesozoic era, and it began after the worst extinction event known from the fossil record. Most marine species disappeared at the end of the Permian, and many land animals vanished as well. The world that entered the Triassic was not empty, but it was damaged, simplified, and unstable. Recovery did not happen all at once. Forests had to return, soils had to stabilize, rivers had to carry life back across the continents. In some places, the early Triassic fossil record shows a long interval when coal was scarce, suggesting that the wetlands and dense plant communities that make coal had not yet fully rebuilt. A planet can survive a catastrophe and still take millions of years to look alive again. By the time dinosaurs appeared, Pangaea was already the largest stage life had ever used. Nearly all the continents were joined into one enormous landmass, stretching from high northern latitudes to the far south. Its outline was not a neat circle, but a broad, broken shape surrounded by one global ocean and crossed by climates that changed sharply from coast to interior. It is tempting to imagine one connected continent as one continuous habitat. In reality, Pangaea was divided by distance, heat, mountains, deserts, rivers, monsoons, and the slow separation of wet lowlands from dry basins. An animal could walk across land from what is now South America to what is now Africa, or from Europe toward Asia. But that did not mean every journey was easy or every environment welcoming. The interior of the supercontinent was vast enough to make seasons extreme. Far from the moderating influence of the sea, heat built over the land. Rain could arrive in powerful pulses, then vanish for long intervals. Lake beds expanded and contracted. Rivers cut into red sediment. Dust moved across open ground. The Triassic was warm, often dry, and in many regions governed by the rhythm of drought and sudden water. Still, life came back. Conifers stood where flowering trees would one day grow. Seed ferns and cycads spread their fronds in open woodland. Horsetails crowded wet channels. Ferns returned in forms both low and tree-like. There were no meadows of grass, no fruiting orchards, no petals turning toward insects. The green world was older than that, built from plants whose descendants now survive mostly as fragments of a much larger past. Across those landscapes moved animals that were not dinosaurs, but shaped the world dinosaurs had to enter. There were synapsids, distant relatives of mammals, some small and hardy after the end Permian collapse. There were large amphibians in rivers and wetlands. There were early turtles, early mammal relatives, strange long-necked reptiles, gliding forms, and an expanding radiation of archosaurs, the greater group that would eventually include crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. For much of the Triassic, the land was not ruled by dinosaurs. It was dominated by other archosaurs, especially the crocodile-line relatives known as pseudosuchians. Some of them looked nothing like modern crocodiles. Some walked high on their legs, some were armored herbivores, some were powerful predators. Some occupied roles that later dinosaurs would make famous, but they reached them first. Imagine a floodplain in what is now Argentina or Brazil. The river is shallow in the dry season, broken into muddy pools. Small reptiles move along the bank. A temnospondyl amphibian waits half-hidden in the water. A large archosaur passes under conifers, its body carried on limbs that lifted above the ground. Somewhere nearby, a small dinosaur moves quickly through the brush, alert, narrow-headed, and still relatively rare. The earliest dinosaur history is difficult to reconstruct because the fossils are scattered, incomplete, and separated by enormous gaps. Many finds from the Middle and Late Triassic belong not to true dinosaurs, but to close relatives called dinosauromorphs. These animals help show the steps toward the dinosaur body plan, but they also remind us that origins are seldom clean lines. Evolution usually begins as a blurred edge. Dinosauromorphs had already experimented with upright posture and long hind limbs before the first unquestioned dinosaurs appear clearly in the fossil record. Some, like silesaurids, were close enough to dinosaurs that scientists continue to debate exactly where they belong on the family tree. They were part of the same larger transformation, a set of small, agile archosaurs testing new ways to move through Pangaea. In the bones, the change can look modest. A hip socket opens, a femur shifts its angle. The ankle becomes a more stable hinge. The body rises away from the sprawl of many earlier reptiles. But those details changed how an animal walked, how it turned, how far it could travel, how quickly it could accelerate, and how efficiently it could carry itself over hot ground. The first dinosaurs were not conquerors in the way a map might suggest. They did not pour across Pangaea in a single wave, pushing every rival aside. They appeared within ecosystems that already worked without them. Their takeover was slower, more uneven, and more interesting. It was a story of endurance, geography, climate stress, and opportunity opening only after other lineages had held the land for millions of years. If lost dinosaur worlds like this are what bring you to Jurassical, subscribing keeps the next journey close. To follow the takeover, we have to begin before the dinosaurs were famous, before sauropods towered over forests, before tyrannosaurs cast shadows in Cretaceous river valleys, before birds carried dinosaur anatomy into the modern sky. We have to stand in the Triassic, on one connected world, and watch a group of small reptiles become the foundation for the most recognizable animals in Earth's deep past. The end Permian extinction sits behind every Triassic scene like a scar under new skin. It happened before the dinosaurs, but it shaped the continent they would inherit. Volcanism in Siberia, climate warming, ocean anoxia, acidification, and cascading ecological failure stripped away older communities that had been built through the Paleozoic. When the Triassic began, survival itself had become the dominant pattern. On land, many of the great synapsids that had filled Permian ecosystems were gone. In the sea, reefs had collapsed, trilobites had disappeared forever, and marine communities were reduced to a fraction of their former complexity. The first Triassic landscapes were not cinematic in the usual sense. They were harsh, sparse, and recovering. In some basins, the fossil record suggests low diversity stretched across intervals that lasted far longer than human civilization has existed. Lystrosaurus, a squat, beaked synapsid, became one of the emblematic survivors. Its bones are found across parts of southern Pangaea, including Africa, India, and Antarctica, evidence of both its success and the connectedness of the world it inhabited. It was not a dinosaur. It was not even an archosaur. But it mattered, because it shows that after extinction, the winners are often not the most impressive animals, only the ones with the right tolerances at the right time. The early Triassic did not yet belong to dinosaurs because dinosaurs had not yet evolved. The ecosystems that formed after the Great Dying were built from survivors and newly diversifying lineages. Reptiles expanded. Archosaurs began to rise. Marine reptiles entered the oceans in forms that would later produce ichthyosaurs and other sea-going specialists. Amphibians still held important places in freshwater. The world was rebuilding with whatever survived. Across the wide interior of Pangaea, heat mattered. So did water. Rivers could concentrate life in narrow bands of green, while away from the channels the land became dry, open, and difficult. Plants adapted to stress. Animals moved between refuges. Drought and rain became powerful filters, determining where communities could persist and where bones would be left on cracked mud. These early recoveries were not smooth progress. There were setbacks, local collapses, and long intervals when ecosystems remained fragile. The fossil record is uneven, so we should not imagine one planet-wide scene repeating everywhere. Some regions recovered faster than others. Some remained limited by heat or dryness. Some preserved fossils well enough for us to see them. Others may have been full of life and left almost nothing behind. The archosaurs were among the great beneficiaries of this rebuilding world. They shared a common ancestor but divided into major branches, including the line that would lead toward crocodilians and the line that would lead toward pterosaurs and dinosaurs. In the Triassic, both branches were expanding. They did not yet resemble the modern versions of themselves, and that is part of what makes the period so strange. Crocodile line archosaurs, the pseudosuchians, were especially diverse. Atosaurs carried heavy armor and fed mostly on plants or omnivorous diets. Rauisuchians and their relatives became large predators with deep skulls and powerful limbs. Phytosaurs, though not true crocodiles, looked crocodile-like in the most obvious ways, with long snouts and semi-aquatic habits, but their nostrils sat far back near the eyes, marking them as something different. The dinosaur line archosaurs began with less spectacle. Their relatives were often lightly built animals with long legs and narrow bodies. They were not armored like atosaurs, not massive like some Rauisuchians, not aquatic ambush predators like phytosaurs. Their advantages were quieter. Upright limbs, efficient movement, a body that could run, pause, turn, and run again across warm ground. A small dinosauromorph leaving tracks in damp sediment might not have looked like the beginning of anything. Its body would have been low in mass, its neck alert, its feet narrow, its tail held for balance. Around it moved animals larger and more established. Yet the track itself records a new kind of motion, a lightness that would become important later, when the world began to favor endurance over bulk. The bones of these animals do not announce destiny. They show anatomy. Paleontologists read them through joints, scars, proportions, and repeated patterns across specimens. A femur can reveal posture. A pelvis can reveal relationships. Teeth can suggest diet. Footprints can show stride and group movement when bones are absent. The takeover of Pangaea is pieced together from such details, one quarry and one surface at a time. The Triassic was also when the sky began to change. Pterosaurs appeared by the late Triassic, becoming the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Their early forms were modest compared with the giants that would come later, but the importance of the innovation was enormous. While dinosaurs were still becoming established on land, their close relatives had already found a way into the air. In the same broad interval, mammal line survivors continued along a quieter road. Early mammalia forms were small, likely active at night, and tied to senses that worked in darkness. They were not taking over Pangaea. They were surviving within it, finding spaces too small for larger reptiles to control. That strategy would remain important for the rest of the Mesozoic. This is one of the central truths of the Triassic. It was not simply the beginning of the dinosaurs, it was the beginning of many futures at once. Crocodile line archosaurs flourished, pterosaurs took flight, mammal relatives refined smallness, marine reptiles spread through the seas. Dinosaurs were present within this larger experiment, and their eventual dominance makes sense only when we remember how crowded the world already was. In the Badlands of northwestern Argentina, the Esquigualasto Formation exposes layers of rock that were once floodplains, channels, soils, and lakes near the western edge of Gondwana. Today, the outcrops are pale, dry, and cut into strange shapes by erosion. In the late Triassic, they were part of a living basin where rivers moved through seasonal landscapes and buried the remains of animals that now sit close to the beginning of dinosaur history. Esquigualasto is important because it preserves some of the oldest widely accepted dinosaurs. Herrerasaurus moved through that world as a bipedal predator with long hind limbs, grasping hands, and a skull lined with sharp teeth. Eoraptor, smaller and more lightly built, carried a mixture of features that has made its exact position in early dinosaur relationships a subject of long discussion. Pangaea hints at the early history of sauropodomorphs, the lineage that would one day produce immense long-necked herbivores. These animals were not alone, and they were not the majority of the fauna. The same rocks preserve rhynchosaurs, cynodonts, pseudosuchians, and other reptiles that were far more abundant in many layers. This matters. The earliest dinosaurs we can name did not immediately transform their ecosystems. They appeared as rare members of communities still dominated by older Triassic groups. A Herrerasaurus skeleton does not look like a tentative animal. It looks capable. The jaws are deep enough to be dangerous. The hind limbs suggest a predator that could move quickly. The forelimbs retain useful grasping hands, yet even an animal like this lived in a world where other predators and herbivores were already established. Its success was local, real, and still limited. That local success is part of the larger pattern. During the late Triassic, the earliest clear dinosaurs appear mostly in southern Pangaea, especially in parts of what are now South America and southern Africa, with other important records from India and later from places farther north. Their distribution tells us that the group was spreading, but not evenly. Pangaea was connected, yet climate and ecology controlled movement as surely as an ocean might. The age of the oldest dinosaurs is usually placed around 230 million years ago for the clearest fossil evidence, though the broader dinosaur lineage must have originated earlier. This difference between a lineage's origin and its first strong fossil appearance is important. Animals do not become fossils on command. They live, die, decay, and only rarely enter the right kind of sediment at the right time. Before the bones appear, there are hints, footprints, fragmentary limbs, close relatives. The trackways are especially seductive because they feel immediate. A foot pressed into mud does not need a skull to explain that an animal passed by, but tracks can be difficult to assign. Similar feet can leave similar prints, and the Triassic is full of near-dinosaur animals walking on narrow toes. In South America, recent finds continue to sharpen the picture of dinosauromorph diversity. Silesaurids and other close relatives show that the dinosaur neighborhood was busy before the dinosaurs themselves became obvious. Some researchers have proposed that certain silesaurids may sit very close to the origin of ornithischians, the great herbivorous dinosaur branch that later includes stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, hadrosaurs, and horned dinosaurs. The debate remains active, which is exactly what a difficult origin should produce. Dinosauria itself is defined by relationships, not by fame. The group includes the last common ancestor of birds and the classic dinosaur lineages, along with all descendants of that ancestor. That means a hummingbird outside a modern window is inside the same evolutionary group as Herrerasaurus, Plateosaurus, Triceratops, and Tyrannosaurus. The Triassic does not merely introduce extinct animals. It introduces a lineage that still has living members. The early split between major dinosaur groups is more complicated than the old museum diagrams once suggested. Traditionally, dinosaurs were divided into Saurischia and Ornithischia, with theropods and sauropodomorphs on the Saurischian side. Newer analyses have sometimes rearranged those relationships, placing theropods closer to ornithischians in a group called Ornithocelida. The details are debated, but the larger point remains steady. By the late Triassic, dinosaur evolution had already begun branching into distinct futures. One future led toward theropods, the bipedal predators, and later birds. Another led towards sauropodomorphs, whose early members were still far from the giants of the Jurassic, but already experimenting with long necks, large guts, and herbivory. Another led toward ornithischians, though their earliest Triassic record is faint enough to remain one of the most frustrating absences in the early dinosaur story. A tiny ornithischian ancestor may have moved through Triassic vegetation without leaving bones that we have found. Its descendants would become some of the most abundant herbivores of later ages, but in the Triassic their earliest history is nearly invisible. This invisibility is not failure, it is preservation. Small animals vanish easily from the fossil record, especially in environments where bones are scattered, crushed, or dissolved before burial. Dinosaurs were not born into an empty throne room. They began as one set of bodies among many. Their hips, ankles, and posture gave them possibilities. Their eggs and growth patterns may have helped. Their respiratory biology may have carried advantages inherited by later forms, but none of that guaranteed domination. For tens of millions of years, they remained part of a contested world. Pangaea made the Triassic different from every later chapter of the dinosaur age. In the Jurassic and Cretaceous, the continents would begin to drift into separate worlds, carrying dinosaur populations into isolation. In the Triassic, the land was gathered into one enormous body. The distances were still immense, but the possibility of movement was written into the geography. A lineage could spread far without crossing an ocean if it could survive the climates in between. The supercontinent was not flat. Mountains rose where older collisions had stitched landmasses together. Basins sagged and filled with river sediment. Coastal plains bordered shallow seas. Interior deserts occupied broad zones far from reliable moisture. Near some margins, monsoon systems brought seasonal rain, and the contrast between wet months and dry months could be strong enough to reshape rivers, vegetation, and animal movement year after year. This seasonal world left sedimentary signatures. Red beds speak of oxidized soils and dry conditions. Mud cracks record surfaces exposed to air. Channel sandstones mark river courses that shifted across lowlands. Fossilized roots show where plants once held the ground together. In some places, repeated lake deposits show basins that filled and shrank under climate rhythms, preserving fish, amphibians, reptiles, and the occasional dinosaur bone when conditions were right. A connected continent also meant connected dangers. Disease, drought, fires, and climate belts could affect enormous regions. At the same time, local refuges mattered. A river valley could hold moisture while nearby uplands dried. A coastal basin could support forests, while the interior became open and harsh. Animals did not respond to Pangaea as a map. They responded to water, food, cover, temperature, and the pressure of other animals. When we say dinosaurs spread across Pangaea, we should not picture a simple conquest line moving from one side of the continent to the other. The fossil record suggests pulses, delays, and uneven appearances. Some regions preserve dinosaurs early. Some preserve close relatives. Some preserve ecosystems where dinosaurs were absent or rare even late in the Triassic. The takeover was not uniform. It depended on place. Modern maps make this difficult because the Triassic world has been broken and rearranged. Argentina was not where it is now. Morocco lay close to eastern North America. India, Antarctica, Africa, Australia, and South America were joined in Gondwana. Europe was part of the northern landmass, surrounded in places by shallow seas and island systems. The Atlantic Ocean had not yet opened. The geography of familiar names was still folded together. A fossil found in Brazil can speak to Africa. A trackway in eastern North America can echo forms known from Europe. Similarities across distant modern continents often make sense only when the old map is restored and the gaps between them close. Pangaea turns isolated discoveries into a single, restless landscape, even when the rocks now lie thousands of kilometers apart. Yet the connectedness of Pangaea may have slowed some dinosaur expansion, rather than speeding it. Large arid zones in the tropics and subtropics could have acted as barriers. Some studies of early dinosaur distribution suggest that climate restricted where certain groups could thrive. Dinosaurs may have originated in one part of southern Pangaea and then spread outward only when wetter corridors, shifting climates, or ecological disruptions gave them roots through harsher belts. This is why climate is not background scenery in the Triassic. It is one of the main characters. Temperature, rainfall, and seasonality shaped the first dinosaur communities. Early dinosaurs did not simply possess a superior design that let them occupy every ecosystem. They needed landscapes where their bodies and diets worked. In other regions, pseudotsuchians and other reptiles remained stronger, more numerous, or better established. The rocks of the Chinle Formation in the American Southwest show how complex these late Triassic ecosystems could be. Petrified logs lie in badlands that were once river systems. Phytosaurs, atosaurs, metaposaur amphibians, early crocodilomorphs, and many other animals occupied those environments. Dinosaurs were present in some parts of the larger region, but not always dominant. In some assemblages, the absence or scarcity of dinosaurs is just as informative as their presence elsewhere. A takeover can be measured by abundance as much as by arrival. One bone in a quarry proves existence. Many bones in many places suggest ecological weight. In the Triassic, dinosaurs crossed the first threshold early. They existed. The second threshold took longer. They had to become common enough, diverse enough, and ecologically important enough to change what land ecosystems were. That change can be watched in fragments. A carnivore grows larger. A herbivore lineage gains body mass. A trackway surface shows multiple three-toed walkers moving across a basin. A bone bed preserves juveniles and adults of a single species, hinting at repeated presence in the same environment. The evidence is never as complete as we want it to be, but it is enough to show that by the late Triassic, dinosaurs were no longer just experiments. Still, the old rulers did not vanish at the first sign of dinosaur success. Pseudotsuchians continued to be formidable. Phytosaurs remained common in many freshwater systems. Atosaurs were widespread armored herbivores. Large predators outside Dinosauria still hunted. The Triassic world was not waiting for dinosaurs. It was busy, functioning, and dangerous. The advantage of dinosaurs may have been partly ecological patience. They did not need to win every habitat at once. A small theropod could succeed where larger predators were absent, or where speed mattered. A sauropodomorph could feed in ways that differed from armored herbivores or rhynchosaurs. A lineage could remain minor for millions of years and then expand when competitors declined. Evolution often works through persistence before dominance. From the perspective of deep time, the takeover of Pangaea looks less like invasion than weathering. Dinosaurs endured the heat, the seasonal rivers, the competition, the fragmentation of habitats within one continent, and the repeated instability of the Triassic. They were shaped by limits long before they were released from them. The animals that would later tower over the Jurassic began by learning how to survive a difficult world. In some Triassic rocks, the dry story changes. The sediment, the pollen, the plant remains, and the chemistry begin to suggest a wetter interval, a shift in climate that spread across parts of the world during the Carnian Age. Scientists call it the Carnian pluvial episode, though the name can make it sound tidier than it was. It was not one endless rainstorm. It was a complex interval of environmental disturbance, increased humidity in many regions, and ecological turnover. The timing matters because it falls close to a key phase in early dinosaur history. Dinosaurs likely originated before or during this broad interval, but the Carnian pluvial episode may have helped them diversify. Changes in rainfall can open corridors, transform vegetation, stress established herbivores, and make room for animals with different bodies and diets. A wetter Pangaea, even temporarily wetter, could have allowed some dinosaur lineages to move into places that had been too dry or too difficult before. This does not mean rain created dinosaurs. Evolution is rarely that simple. The first dinosaurs were already part of the Archosaur world, and their origins lie in anatomy, ancestry, and long-term ecological patterns. But environmental change can determine whether a lineage remains local and minor or begins to spread. Climate does not invent a body plan, but it can decide where that body plan gets tested. Imagine a basin after the rains return. Dry channels fill. Ferns expand along watercourses. Conifer seedlings take root in damp sediment. Small animals follow the green margins. Predators follow them. Mud holds footprints. A dinosaur that had once moved between shrinking water sources now finds a wider, more connected landscape, with more cover, more prey, and perhaps fewer of the old barriers that kept populations apart. The Carnian pluvial episode has been linked by some research to increased dinosaur diversification, particularly in the timing and distribution of early dinosaur fossils and footprints. The evidence is not a single smoking gun. It comes from correlations between climate signals, sedimentary changes, and biological appearances in different regions. The pattern is suggestive, and it has become one of the major ideas in explaining why dinosaurs began to matter more during the late Triassic. During wetter intervals, plant communities changed. Seed ferns, conifers, cycads, and other plants responded to shifts in moisture and temperature. Herbivores that depended on certain vegetation types may have been stressed if their food changed or moved. Animals tied to dry habitats may have retreated. Generalists may have done well. Young dinosaur lineages, still flexible in body size and diet, could have found openings in that reorganization. Early sauropodomorphs are especially important here. These were the distant forerunners of the giant sauropods, but in the Triassic they were often much smaller and more variable. Some were lightly built and possibly omnivorous. Others were becoming committed herbivores with longer necks, larger bodies, and digestive systems suited for processing plants. Their expansion marks one of the first great dinosaur herbivore stories. A small sauropodomorph moving through Triassic vegetation would not yet resemble Diplodocus or Brachiosaurus. Its head was larger in proportion. Its forelimbs were more useful for movement or manipulation. Its body could still be bipedal or at least capable of rising. But the direction of change was visible. Longer reach. Greater gut capacity. A shift toward taking energy from plants in a world where plant communities were themselves changing. Teeth record that transition. Some early forms had teeth suited to mixed diets, with shapes that could handle soft plant material and perhaps other foods. Later sauropodomorphs show more obvious adaptations for cropping vegetation. A tooth is a small fossil, but it can carry the outline of an ecological shift. It tells us what an animal met first: prey that resisted, leaves that wore enamel, stems that had to be sliced or stripped. The Carnian world was not gentle. Wetter conditions can bring abundance, but also instability. Rivers flood. Lakes expand over nests and burrows. Disease spreads in crowded water sources. Vegetation thickens in one place and disappears in another. Animals drawn to the same resources compete more intensely. A wetter Pangaea may have helped dinosaurs, but it also would have tested them. Every advantage has a cost. If early dinosaurs were active, fast-growing, and efficient walkers, they still needed food and safety. Juveniles were vulnerable. Eggs could dry, flood, or be eaten. Small predators could take hatchlings. Larger predators could take adults. A lineage spreads only if each generation survives enough ordinary dangers to leave another generation behind. In some places, the evidence of early dinosaur presence is not a skeleton, but a footprint. These tracks can be found in rocks once laid down by wet surfaces, sometimes near lakes or river margins. Their makers may remain unnamed because no body fossil lies nearby, but their feet show repeated visits to the same kinds of places: water edges, damp flats, soft sediment left by seasonal flows. Footprints are imperfect, but they are intimate. A bone can be carried by water after death. A footprint must be made by a living animal at the place where it is preserved. It shows posture, direction, and sometimes speed. When many prints occur together, they can suggest patterns of movement across a landscape. In Triassic trackways, the dinosaur story becomes less about famous names and more about motion. The Carnian pluvial episode eventually ended. Dryness returned in many regions. Climate belts shifted again. The animals that had expanded under wetter conditions had to adjust to a different world. Some disappeared. Others persisted in refuges. Dinosaurs continued, not everywhere and not always in the same roles, but with a larger footprint than before, both literally in the rock and ecologically in the communities they entered. This is the shape of the Triassic Takeover at its midpoint. A damaged planet recovering from one extinction. A supercontinent divided by climate. A wetter pulse disturbing old patterns. Small dinosaurs and their close relatives moving through the openings. Nothing inevitable yet. No guarantee that the future belongs to them. Only a set of traits meeting a changing world and leaving enough evidence for us to see that the balance had begun to shift. A Triassic dinosaur quarry rarely offers the clean drama of a single skeleton waiting whole in the ground. More often, it gives pieces. A jaw weathering from a slope. A femur found apart from the rest of the animal. Vertebrae scattered by water before burial. Ribs crushed flat by the pressure of sediment. The animal has to be reassembled through comparison, and sometimes the most important conclusion is not what the fossil says clearly, but what it refuses to say. In Brazil, late Triassic rocks have become central to the search for early dinosaur history. The Santa Maria and Candelria sequences preserve a world close in age and geography to Argentina's earliest dinosaur faunas. Here, sauropodomorphs, herrerasaurids, silesaurids, cynodonts, rhynchosaurs, and other reptiles appear in changing combinations. Each new specimen adds texture to the old map of southern Pangaea, showing that early dinosaur evolution was not confined to one valley or one famous formation. Herrerasaurids are especially revealing because they show how early predatory dinosaurs and near dinosaurs were exploring large carnivorous roles without yet becoming the dominant predators everywhere. Herrerasaurus itself was formidable, but its relatives remain difficult to place in some analyses. Their anatomy is primitive in some respects and specialized in others. They remind us that early dinosaur evolution did not move in a straight line toward later theropods. A skull from a herrerasaurid carries a mix of familiarity and strangeness. There are sharp teeth and a predatory jaw, but the proportions do not yet match the later theropods that would dominate Jurassic ecosystems. The hands are functional. The limbs are built for bipedal movement. The animal seems both close to the dinosaurs we think we know and separate from them, standing near the root of a branching tree whose later limbs would grow in very different directions. Eoraptor has often been presented as a beginning, but even beginnings become complicated under close study. Its teeth and skeleton have been interpreted in more than one way, and its relationships have shifted as new fossils and analyses appear. This is not a weakness of paleontology. It is how the field works. Early forms are mosaics. They carry traits that later lineages separate, and that makes them difficult but valuable. The living animal would not have cared about its taxonomic uncertainty. It would have moved through brush, watched for small prey, avoided larger predators, and searched for food under the same sun as every other Triassic creature. Its bones became part of a scientific debate only because sediment covered them, and time did not destroy them completely. To the animal, there was only the floodplain, the heat, the next movement in the leaves. Pangaea, another early dinosaur from Argentina, suggests a point near the base of the sauropodomorph line. The name refers to an animal that may have eaten a broad diet, and that idea fits the uncertain ecology of early dinosaur herbivory. Before there were immense plant eaters with vast digestive systems, there were smaller bodies making use of whatever the landscape offered: soft shoots, seeds, leaves, insects, carrion, perhaps all of these in different seasons. As sauropodomorphs diversified, their bodies began moving toward greater size. A larger body helps a herbivore in several ways. It can hold a longer gut, allowing plant material more time to ferment. It can reduce vulnerability to some predators. It can carry the animal across larger distances between food sources. But size also demands more energy, more water, and more time spent feeding. In a seasonal Triassic landscape, growing bigger was both opportunity and risk. The earliest clear dinosaur communities were still low in diversity compared with later Jurassic faunas. A few dinosaur species lived among many non-dinosaur species. This pattern appears in several key late Triassic deposits. Dinosaurs were spreading, but their rise was ecological before it was numerical. They were finding roles, testing diets, changing sizes, and establishing lineages that would become more important after the Triassic ended. Close relatives complicate the picture further. Silesaurids, for example, were often lightly built quadrupeds with beak-like features in some forms and teeth adapted for plant material or mixed diets. They were not classic dinosaurs in the popular sense, but they lived near the dinosaur stem and may be close to the origin of ornithischians. If some of them are reinterpreted as early ornithischians, the early dinosaur record changes substantially. This is why a small jaw in a museum drawer can matter as much as a mounted skeleton. Classification is not just naming. It changes where we place entire branches of life. It changes when we think herbivory appeared, when certain body plans evolved, and how quickly dinosaurs began dividing into the groups that later shaped the Mesozoic. A field jacket opened in a preparation lab may hold a rib, a vertebra, and nothing more. The bone is cleaned slowly with needles and air tools. Sediment falls away in grains. The preparator may reveal a surface no living eye has seen for more than 200 million years. If the fossil is diagnostic, it can shift a timeline. If it is too incomplete, it still records presence, and presence is not nothing. The Triassic Takeover is built from these modest certainties. A dinosaur was here. A close relative was here. A sauropodomorph had reached this basin. A predator of this lineage lived beside these rhynchosaurs. A trackmaker crossed this mud. None of these facts alone gives us conquest. Together, spread across millions of years, they reveal expansion. The expansion was biological, but it was also behavioral. Dinosaurs laid eggs. They grew from small juveniles into adults that could occupy different roles within the same species. Some may have gathered in groups, at least at certain life stages or in certain environments. Some traveled across floodplains in repeated patterns. Behavior rarely fossilizes directly, but bone beds, trackways, growth rings, and nesting evidence from later dinosaurs help frame what may have been possible in their Triassic ancestors. Still, caution is necessary. We cannot simply take the behavior of later dinosaurs and project it backward. A Cretaceous nesting colony does not prove Triassic nesting behavior. A Jurassic sauropod herd does not prove a Plateosaurus herd. The evidence suggests possibilities, not guarantees. Good dinosaur storytelling has to leave room for uncertainty, because the rock keeps more secrets than it gives away. At the same time, uncertainty should not make the animals fade. A Triassic dinosaur did not live as a question mark. It breathed, digested, moved, reacted, healed from injuries, and made choices within the limits of instinct and environment. Paleontology may approach it through fragments, but the animal itself was whole. That gap between fossil and life is where the imagination has to work carefully. Staying close to the evidence without pretending the evidence says more than it does. To understand why the dinosaur takeover took so long, you have to look at the animals that blocked it. Pseudosuchians were not background creatures waiting to be replaced. They were successful archosaurs with their own evolutionary momentum. In many Triassic ecosystems, they were the armored bodies in the undergrowth, the big predators on the floodplain, the river ambushers at the water's edge, and the heavy herbivores moving through open country. Atosaurs are among the most visually striking. Their bodies were covered in bony armor plates called osteoderms, arranged across the back and sides like living shields. Some had broad, shovel-shaped snouts that may have been used to root through soil or plant matter. They were widespread across Pangaea, and their armor suggests a world where even plant eaters were under constant pressure from predators, capable of doing serious damage. Phytosaurs filled many aquatic ambush roles. At a glance, they can look like crocodiles, with long jaws, conical teeth, and bodies suited for water. But they were not crocodiles, and their nostrils were set far back on the skull near the eyes. This detail is one of those anatomical signatures that changes the story. Similar lifestyles can produce similar bodies, even in animals that sit on different branches of the archosaur tree. Rauisuchians and other large predatory pseudosuchians could stand as tall threats over Triassic landscapes. Some had deep skulls and powerful limbs held beneath the body, giving them an elevated stance that earlier sprawling reptiles lacked. These animals were not clumsy throwbacks. They were active, dangerous, and in many places they occupied the apex predator roles that later theropod dinosaurs would take over. A small dinosaur moving through that world had to know the cover. It had to use speed, distance, and timing. The danger did not always come from another dinosaur. It might come from a crocodile line predator stepping through dust, or from a riverbank head that seemed like mud until it opened. The Triassic land was full of jaws that had evolved before dinosaurs became common. Even herbivorous competition was difficult. Rhynchosaurs, stocky reptiles with powerful beaks and broad skulls, were abundant in some Middle and Late Triassic ecosystems. Dicynodonts, the beaked synapsids that had survived from older worlds, persisted in some regions as large-bodied herbivores. Atosaurs carried armor into plant-eating niches. Early sauropodomorphs had to enter a crowded herbivore guild, not an empty cafeteria. This competition may explain why dinosaurs remained relatively rare in many assemblages for so long. They were not failing to evolve. They were constrained by ecosystems where other animals already did similar jobs well. The early dinosaur advantage was not always strength. It may have been flexibility, the ability of small lineages to persist around the edges of established systems, then expand when climate, extinction, or geography weakened the old arrangement. The fossil record can make this visible through proportions. In some Triassic faunas, dinosaur bones represent only a small fraction of the known animals. In others, especially later in the period or in certain regions, they become more common. That shift is the takeover in slow motion. It is not a single battle. It is the changing composition of bone beds over millions of years. Picture a quarry face. A layer of sandstone holds scattered armor plates from atosaurs, teeth from phytosaurs, limb bones from archosaurs, fragments of amphibian skulls, and a few dinosaur bones. Above it, younger layers preserve different proportions. A sauropodomorph femur appears. Then, another. Theropod tracks become more common. The old groups remain, but the balance is beginning to move. Predation is often the easiest drama to imagine, but ecological takeover usually depends more on ordinary feeding. An animal that can find food reliably in dry seasons will leave more descendants than one that cannot. A herbivore that can digest common plants has an advantage over one tied to a shrinking resource. A predator that can hunt several prey types survives better than one dependent on a single abundant animal that disappears. Dinosaurs may have had physiological traits that helped them in unstable conditions, but the evidence is complex. Many dinosaurs show rapid growth compared with many reptiles, and their posture suggests active movement. Bird-like respiratory systems evolved somewhere along the dinosaur line, though exactly when and how fully they were expressed in early Triassic forms remains debated. These traits could have mattered, but they did not make dinosaurs instantly dominant. There is also the question of heat. A small active animal in a hot landscape has to manage water and body temperature. Upright posture can lift the body away from the hottest ground surface. Efficient movement reduces energy costs. Behavioral choices, such as activity in cooler parts of the day or the use of shade and burrows by some animals, could be just as important as anatomy. Survival is often a mixture of body and habit. The Triassic fossil record rarely lets us see behavior in full. A healed fracture can suggest an animal survived injury. Tooth marks can show feeding or attack. Tracks can show speed, direction, and sometimes group movement. Bone histology can show growth. Each clue is narrow, but together they produce a living outline: animals moving, feeding, resting, escaping, and repeating these actions across millions of days. When dinosaurs did begin to expand, they did so into a world trained by competition. This may be one reason they became so successful later. The Triassic did not hand them dominance cheaply. It forced them to adapt around stronger and more numerous animals. It made them small before they became large, fast before they became massive, and persistent before they became iconic. In that sense, the old reptile rulers were part of the dinosaur story rather than merely obstacles to it. Pseudosuchians shaped the pressures early dinosaurs faced. Rhynchosaurs and Dicynodonts shaped the herbivore landscape. Phytosaurs shaped the danger around rivers. Without those competitors, dinosaur evolution would have followed a different path. The takeover of Pangaea was not dinosaurs replacing emptiness. It was dinosaurs surviving a world already full of answers. One of the most important dinosaur bodies of the late Triassic was not built for terror. It was built for feeding. Plateosaurus and its relatives carried the first great expansion of sauropodomorph dinosaurs across much of Pangaea. Their fossils are found especially well in Europe, where bone beds have preserved multiple individuals and revealed an animal far larger than the earliest small dinosaurs, but still far from the immense sauropods of the Jurassic. Plateosaurus could reach several meters in length, with a long neck, a small head compared with its body, strong hind limbs, and forelimbs that were useful but not yet the pillar-like supports of later giants. It was not a sauropod, but it points toward them. Its body shows a dinosaur lineage learning how to become a major herbivore, increasing gut capacity and feeding reach while still retaining a more flexible, partly bipedal ancestry. The skull and teeth of Plateosaurus suggest a plant-heavy diet, though the exact feeding behavior remains debated. Its teeth were leaf-shaped and coarsely serrated, better suited for cropping vegetation than for slicing meat. The jaw was not designed for sophisticated chewing. Like many later dinosaurs, it probably swallowed plant material after limited oral processing and relied on digestion farther back in the body to extract energy from tough Triassic plants. A Plateosaurus feeding in a conifer woodland would have worked at a height unavailable to smaller herbivores. It could crop leaves and soft shoots from shrubs and low branches. It might rear or shift posture to reach higher growth, though how often it did this is uncertain. The long neck mattered even before sauropods became giants. It let the animal harvest more vegetation without moving the whole body with every bite. In a seasonally dry basin, this reach could be important. Leaves may remain on taller plants after ground-level vegetation has been stripped or dried. A herbivore that can feed across several height zones has options. It can move along river margins, browse in open woodland, and survive periods when smaller plant eaters are limited to whatever remains near the ground. The success of Plateosaurus-like animals marks a quiet shift in dinosaur history. For the first time, dinosaurs were becoming large herbivores in more than a local or experimental way. They were no longer only small predators or omnivores near the edges of ecosystems. Some were turning plant energy into dinosaur mass on a scale that would change food webs. Late Triassic sauropodomorphs spread widely. Plateosaurus is best known from Europe, but related forms occur across other parts of Pangaea. In South America, animals such as Rheogosaurus show larger-bodied sauropodomorph experimentation. Lesomsaurids, including forms from Argentina and South Africa, reached impressive size by Triassic standards and carried features that foreshadowed later sauropod gigantism, even if their bodies were still different from true Jurassic giants. The increase in sauropodomorph body size created new relationships with predators. A small dinosaur can hide. A large herbivore cannot rely on hiding in the same way. It must use size, vigilance, perhaps group movement, and the simple difficulty of being safely attacked. A predator that can kill a lizard-sized animal may not be equipped to bring down a several-ton herbivore with strong limbs and a dangerous kick. But juveniles would have been vulnerable. Every large dinosaur begins as a small body leaving an egg. A young sauropodomorph would have moved through a world full of teeth, small theropods, crocodilomorphs, pseudosuchians, maybe even larger adults competing for food or space. The fossil record rarely preserves these everyday deaths in detail, but the mathematics of survival demands them. Many young animals died, so a few could reach adult size. Some Plateosaurus bone beds have raised questions about how these animals died. Certain deposits preserve multiple individuals in ways that may relate to drought, mud traps, or repeated accumulation in a dangerous landscape. The details are debated, but the image is plausible. Animals drawn to a shrinking water source, heavy bodies pressing into soft sediment, drought tightening its grip, bones later buried by floodwater when the season turned again. We should be cautious with any single death scenario. Bone beds can form through many processes. Bodies may accumulate over years or centuries. Water can move bones from different places into one deposit. Yet even with caution, these sites show that sauropodomorphs were common enough in some late Triassic environments to leave repeated remains. Abundance is a form of evidence. It tells us the lineage was no longer rare. A large sauropodomorph skeleton in a museum can look awkward at first, as if the animal is unfinished between smaller dinosaurs and sauropods. That awkwardness is misleading. Transitional forms are not incomplete versions of what comes later. Plateosaurus was adapted to its own time. It did not exist to become Diplodocus. It existed to survive late Triassic forests, floodplains, and dry basins, and for millions of years it did that well. The body plan worked because it balanced reach, mass, and mobility. The animal could move on strong hind limbs, use forelimbs for support or feeding-related behavior, and process enough vegetation to maintain a larger body. It did not need the extreme pneumatic skeletons or columnar limbs of later sauropods. Those innovations would come later, under different pressures. In the Triassic, this intermediate size was already a breakthrough. Sauropodomorph success also changed what predators could become. Where large herbivores exist, large predators may eventually follow. But predator evolution often lags behind herbivore abundance. The late Triassic had big predators outside Dinosauria, and some theropods increased in size, but the classic dinosaur predator-herbivore system of the Jurassic was still forming. Plateosaurus and its relatives helped build the prey base that later theropods would exploit. There is a quiet importance in an animal that eats leaves. The famous drama of dinosaurs often centers on jaws and claws, but ecosystems are built from plants passing into herbivore bodies. The sauropodomorphs began turning Triassic vegetation into dinosaur tissue at a scale no earlier dinosaur had achieved. They did not conquer Pangaea by violence. They did it by feeding, growing, surviving dry seasons, and leaving bones in enough places for the pattern to become undeniable. Somewhere in late Triassic Europe, a Plateosaurus lowered its long neck toward a branch, while dust moved under conifers. It did not know it belonged near the beginning of a lineage that would later raise heads into Jurassic canopies. It knew only hunger, heat, the position of water, the movement of other animals nearby. The future was present in its bones, but hidden from the animal itself. While sauropodomorphs were learning to grow larger on plants, theropods were refining another inheritance, the fast, bipedal predator. The Triassic theropod was not yet the towering shape that later appears in Jurassic floodplains. Many were slender animals, narrow in the head and body, with long hind limbs and tails that kept balance through sudden changes in direction. Their power was not mass. It was speed, reach, and the ability to react. Coelophysis is the best-known image of this world. Its fossils from Ghost Ranch in New Mexico are among the most famous late Triassic dinosaur remains, preserved in large numbers and giving paleontologists an unusually clear view of one early theropod body. Coelophysis was lightly built, with a long neck, a narrow skull, sharp recurved teeth, and a body length of roughly a few meters, though much of that was tail. It lived near the end of the Triassic, in landscapes that included rivers, floodplains, seasonal water sources, and a diverse assemblage of reptiles and other animals. Coelophysis was a dinosaur, but it was not yet an apex predator on the scale of later theropods. It likely hunted small vertebrates, insects, and other manageable prey, and it may have scavenged when carcasses were available. Its body was built for quick feeding opportunities rather than brute force. The Ghost Ranch accumulation has inspired many interpretations. A large number of individuals preserved together suggests some kind of mass death or repeated concentration. Drought, flood, poisoned water, or other environmental stresses have all been considered in various ways. What remains clear is that Coelophysis was present in enough numbers to be one of the signature dinosaurs of its environment. Older claims that Coelophysis showed direct evidence of cannibalism have been reconsidered. Small bones found within larger specimens were once interpreted as young Coelophysis eaten by adults, but later studies suggested at least some of these remains belonged to other small reptiles. Cannibalism is possible in many animals, but the evidence in this case is not as simple as early stories made it sound. This is a useful reminder. Triassic dinosaurs have often been pushed into dramatic roles because their fossils are evocative. A slender predator preserved with other bones inside its ribcage invites a story. But science has to return to anatomy, position, and comparison. The most dramatic interpretation is not always the best one. The animal is interesting enough without forcing it into a scene we cannot prove. A living Coelophysis would have been dangerous at close range. Its jaws could seize small prey, its teeth could hold struggling bodies, its limbs could carry it quickly over open ground. But it was also vulnerable. Larger pseudosuchian predators could kill it. A riverbank ambush could take it. Drought could concentrate it with competitors around shrinking water. Its speed helped, but speed does not solve every problem. Other Triassic theropods and early predatory dinosaurs show that this lineage was spreading into multiple regions. Some forms are known from fragmentary material and remain difficult to compare. Others suggest early experimentation in size and skull structure. The theropod story in the Triassic is less complete than in the Jurassic, but the foundations are visible: bipedal carnivory, grasping forelimbs, sharp teeth, and a body plan that would prove astonishingly durable. The theropod body plan solved a basic predatory problem. The head became the primary weapon. The hind limbs handled movement. The tail balanced the body. The forelimbs could grasp or stabilize prey, even before they became reduced in some later lineages or transformed into wings in birds. This division of labor allowed theropods to remain efficient across a huge range of sizes. Small theropods probably hunted along forest edges, river margins, and open flats. They may have followed the activity of smaller reptiles, early mammalia forms, insects, and juvenile dinosaurs. Their daily lives would have been filled with short bursts of action rather than constant combat. Much of predation is waiting, listening, positioning, and choosing not to attack when the odds are wrong. The track record supports the presence of many small to medium bipedal dinosaurs moving through late Triassic landscapes. Three-toed tracks appear in different parts of Pangaea, though assigning them to exact makers is often difficult. A track might belong to a theropod, a basal dinosaur, or a close relative, depending on age and anatomy. Still, the repeated appearance of narrow, bird-like footprints tells us that light bipedal archosaurs were common enough to leave their movements across wet surfaces. Those footprints also change the emotional scale of the story. A named skeleton in a museum can become distant, a specimen with a label. A trackway stays close to behavior. One foot after another. A turn toward water. A pause where prints deepen. A longer stride where the animal accelerated. Even when the maker has no name, the movement survives. Theropods did not conquer Pangaea by becoming huge in the Triassic. Their real victory was establishing a form that could be modified endlessly. Later, some would become giants. Some would remain small. Some would develop feathers. Some would become birds. In the Triassic, the design was still simple and effective. An alert head, a balanced body, long legs, and the capacity to live by pursuing other animals through a world that was itself in motion. If you could stand at a Triassic waterhole near dusk, you might not see Coelophysis at first. You might notice the small animals reacting before you noticed the predator. A pause in the mud. A ripple of movement among low plants. Then a narrow head crossing between shadows, quick enough that the eye catches shape only after the animal has already moved on. The plants of the Triassic did not flower. That absence changes the world more than it first seems. There were no grasses holding open plains in the modern way, no broad fields of seed heads, no fruit hanging from branches, no petals marking seasons with color. The vegetation that fed early dinosaurs belonged to a gymnosperm world of conifers, cycads, seed ferns, ginkgophytes, horsetails, and true ferns. Conifers formed forests and open woodlands across many regions of Pangaea. Some would have looked broadly familiar, with trunks, branches, and narrow leaves adapted to conserve water. Others belonged to extinct forms with growth habits no longer present. In drier regions, conifers and drought-tolerant plants helped define the landscape. Near rivers and wetlands, ferns and horsetails could crowd the margins, producing green corridors through otherwise open ground. For herbivorous dinosaurs, this plant world was both opportunity and challenge. Gymnosperm foliage can be tough, fibrous, and chemically defended. It is not the same as feeding on the leaves, fruits, and grasses that later herbivores would exploit. An animal eating Triassic plants needed a digestive strategy capable of extracting energy from resistant tissues. Teeth could crop and slice, but much of the work likely happened in the gut. Sauropodomorphs were well suited to this problem because increasing body size creates room for larger digestive chambers. A longer gut gives microbes more time to break down plant material. This does not mean every early sauropodomorph was a specialized fermenting machine like a later giant, but the trend toward larger bodies made herbivory more profitable. The animal could take in low-quality food and make it work through volume and time. Other herbivores were doing their own versions of the same calculation. Rhynchosaurs had powerful beaks and complex jaw action for processing plants. Atosaurs used armored bodies and specialized snouts. Dicynodonts carried beaks inherited from an older synapsid history. The Triassic was full of plant-eating experiments, and dinosaurs were only one of them. Their eventual success did not erase the ingenuity of the others. A forest edge would have been a feeding boundary for many animals. Smaller reptiles could take seeds, insects, or low vegetation. Synapsids could browse or root depending on their anatomy. Early dinosaurs could crop leaves, hunt among the shadows, or move between open patches. The plants did not simply sit beneath the story. They organized the traffic of the entire ecosystem. Fossil plants often appear less dramatic than skulls, but they are essential. A leaf impression tells us what grew where. Pollen grains, small enough to travel and survive in sediment, can reveal plant communities even when leaves and trunks are absent. Petrified wood records growth rings, seasonality, and the presence of forests. Charcoal can suggest wildfire. Roots show soils. Together, plant fossils give the animals a world to stand in. The Triassic also had insects, though not the flower-linked communities familiar today. Beetles, cockroaches, flies, dragonfly relatives, and many other groups occupied forest floors, stream sides, and decaying plant matter. Some fed on wood. Some fed on spores or seeds. Some fed on other insects. Small theropods and early mammalia forms would have found protein in this abundance, especially in damp places where insects gathered. Without flowering plants, pollination depended more heavily on wind and older relationships. Conifers released pollen into the air. Cycads and other seed plants used cones and exposed reproductive structures. The seasonal pulse of pollen would have been invisible in the rock unless grains settled into sediments that later preserved them, but in life, it would have been part of the air itself, drifting through forests that no bird song yet filled. The smell of a Triassic forest is impossible to recover fully, but we can infer parts of it. Resin from conifers. Wet mud near horsetails. Decaying fronds. Dust after a dry season. The musk of reptiles moving through shade. The mineral smell of exposed river sediment before rain. These are not fossils, but they help restore the physicality of the world, the sensory field in which the animals lived. We should avoid making Triassic landscapes too uniform. Some were lush and wet. Some were open and dry. Some were coastal. Some were far inland. The same period held monsoonal lowlands and desert interiors, forested basins and salt flats. Dinosaurs did not conquer a single environment. They entered many, and their success depended on how each lineage matched the local conditions. The fossil record of plants also helps explain why the takeover was not immediate. If a region supported herbivore communities built around rhynchosaurs or decinodonts, early dinosaur herbivores might remain minor. If climate changed the vegetation, or if established herbivores declined, sauropodomorphs could expand. A shift in plant communities can ripple upward through the food web, altering which bodies are useful. A dinosaur footprint in mud is only the top layer of a deeper story. Beneath it lies the sediment of a river. Around it grew plants that held the bank together. Insects moved through the leaves. Herbivores fed nearby. Predators watched the herbivores. Climate determined whether the mud was wet enough to receive the print and dry enough to keep it. The track is a single mark, but it belongs to an entire system. This is why the takeover of Pangaea cannot be told only through dinosaur names. Herrerasaurus, Eoraptor, Coelophysis, Plateosaurus, Rheogosaurus. These names matter, but they were carried by living bodies through plant worlds that made them possible. A dinosaur is never only a skeleton. It is also every leaf it ate, every insect it missed, every river it crossed, and every season it survived. Sometimes the Triassic takeover is easier to see in feet than in bones. A trackway can cross a bedding plane for several meters, each print separated by a measured stride, each toe mark angled by the animal's weight and movement. The maker may never be found as a skeleton. Its skull may have decayed in another valley, its bones may have been scattered by scavengers or dissolved before burial. But the feet passed over soft ground, and for one moment the landscape recorded them. Trackways from Triassic rocks occur in many parts of the world, including places that now lie far apart but once belonged to the same supercontinent. Some prints are attributed to theropod like dinosaurs or close relatives. Others may belong to larger dinosauromorphs. The names assigned to tracks are ichnotaxa, names for traces rather than bodies, and they carry their own uncertainty. A track can show form and behavior, but not always identity. A three-toed print does not automatically mean a true dinosaur. This is especially important in Triassic rocks, where dinosaur relatives had feet that could produce similar shapes. Paleontologists look at proportions, digit angles, pad impressions, stride length, age of the rock, and associated fossils. Even then, some trackways remain open to interpretation. The evidence is useful because it is abundant in places where skeletons are rare, but it has to be handled with care. The best track surfaces feel almost like photographs of movement. One animal walks straight across a damp flat. Another turns, leaving prints that rotate slightly as the body shifts direction. A larger animal sinks deeper, pushing mud up around the toes. Small prints cross over older impressions, later mud cracks cut through them all. Then, a new layer buries the surface, and the brief traffic of one Triassic day becomes a page in stone. Tracks can reveal expansion before bones do. If dinosaur-like footprints appear across multiple basins, they suggest that the animals producing them had spread beyond the handful of places where skeletons happen to preserve. This is one reason footprint evidence matters so much in early dinosaur history. It fills the spaces between body fossils and shows that light bipedal archosaurs were moving through Pangaea more widely than skeletons alone might imply. Yet trackways also reveal scale. Many early prints are small. They do not announce giants. They show animals closer in size to dogs, turkeys, wolves, or slender deer than to the monumental dinosaurs that appear later. The takeover began underfoot at a modest scale. A few centimeters of toe length. A stride across mud. A body light enough that the sediment could hold its shape without collapsing. There is a kind of honesty in that. The first dinosaurs were not born enormous. They did not begin as thunder. They began as moving weight, distributed across narrow toes, carried efficiently by limbs held under the body. Their earliest success was the ability to move well through difficult country. Before they became symbols of size, they were animals of balance. In some track sites, repeated prints suggest travel along shorelines or river margins. Animals often use the same natural corridors because water, food, and open ground concentrate there. A Triassic riverbank could become a highway shared by amphibians, archosaurs, synapsids, insects, and dinosaurs. Each group left different traces, and only a few survived. The rock does not preserve a complete day. It preserves the parts of the day that touched the right mud. Movement across Pangaea would have happened generation by generation. No single dinosaur needed to cross the entire supercontinent. A population expands into the next basin. Its descendants reach the next river system. Climate opens a corridor, then closes it. A drought fragments the population. A wetter interval reconnects it. Over millions of years, these ordinary steps become continental spread. This is how conquest often looks in the fossil record. Not a dramatic arrival, but repeated presence. A track here, a tooth there, a partial skeleton in a valley far from the first one. The map slowly fills. Uncertainty remains around the edges, but the signal strengthens. Dinosaurs were moving through Pangaea, and by the late Triassic, they were no longer confined to the places where their story first becomes clear. A footprint is also a reminder that dinosaurs were not ideas. They had weight. Their feet slipped slightly on wet sediment. Their toes spread under pressure. They chose paths around water, through vegetation, and overexposed flats. When we speak of expansion and diversification, we are really speaking of bodies doing simple things over and over until the accumulated result becomes history. Return to the red stone surface. The print is still there, silent under museum light or exposed on a desert slope. It is not a crown, not a victory marker, not proof of sudden rule. It is only a step. But enough steps, preserved across enough landscapes, can tell the story of a lineage moving from the margins toward the center of the world. In the painted badlands of the American Southwest, the Triassic does not feel like the beginning of a dynasty at first. Petrified logs lie in bands of color. Blue, purple, red, and gray sediment marks old rivers and floodplains. The trunks are conifers turned to stone, some carried by water before burial, some preserved so completely that growth rings and cellular structures remain visible. They belong to forests on Pangaea long before the desert took their place. The Chinle Formation and related late Triassic rocks preserve one of the richest windows into life near the end of the period. The landscapes were crossed by rivers and floodplains, with seasonal rains feeding channels that shifted across low country. These rocks hold phytosaurs, atosaurs, metaposaur amphibians, early crocodilomorphs, small reptiles, fish, and plant remains. Dinosaurs appear within this world, but they do not dominate it in the way they would later dominate Jurassic formations. This is a crucial distinction. A formation can be famous for the age of dinosaurs without being full of dinosaurs. In some late Triassic North American ecosystems, dinosaur body fossils are comparatively rare next to other archosaurs. Coelophysis and other dinosaur remains are important, but phytosaurs and armored reptiles often form a larger part of the preserved fauna. The land still belonged to a mixture of lineages. A phytosaur skull from these rocks can be enormous, with jaws shaped for seizing fish or other animals near the water. Its teeth are conical, its snout long, its eyes positioned high. It reminds us that rivers were dangerous places. A dinosaur bending to drink would have been entering a zone controlled by predators older in ecological role than any theropod. Water gave life, but it also hid death. The riverbank was not safe for anyone. Temnospondyl amphibians could wade in shallow water like heavy-headed shadows. Phytosaurs could strike from the edge. Crocodilomorphs, smaller at this time than their later relatives, moved through the same habitats. Theropods hunted near the margins. Even a large herbivore had to lower its head eventually, and every lowered head is a moment of vulnerability. In the same region, adasaurs carried armor across dry ground. Their osteoderms are common enough in some deposits to become part of the visual identity of late Triassic rocks. Adasaur armor plates can preserve ornamented surfaces, grooves, ridges, and patterns that help identify species. These are not just fragments of defense. They are pieces of living animals that once pushed through vegetation, feeding under the pressure of predators. Dinosaurs in these North American deposits show that the group had reached the northern parts of Pangaea by the late Triassic, but arrival and dominance were separate events. Their presence proves dispersal. Their relative rarity in many assemblages shows that ecological control remained contested. This pattern fits a broader Triassic world where dinosaurs expanded without immediately replacing the older archosaur faunas. The absence of dinosaurs in some well-sampled ecosystems can be as meaningful as their abundance elsewhere. If a fossil site preserves many vertebrates and no clear dinosaurs, it may suggest that local conditions did not favor them, or that they had not yet reached that habitat, or that preservation missed them. Each possibility has to be tested. Paleontology often learns from gaps, but only when those gaps are treated carefully. Recent work in places like Petrified Forest National Park continues to show how dynamic these ecosystems were close to the end of the Triassic. Some assemblages include a surprising range of vertebrates and show that many older lineages were still thriving while dinosaurs and pterosaurs were present nearby or in related regions. The picture is not of dinosaurs sweeping aside weak survivors. It is of multiple evolutionary experiments overlapping in a transitional world. The Chinal landscapes also preserve the importance of rivers as fossil-making systems. Floodwaters can bury carcasses quickly, protecting bones from scavengers and weathering. Channel deposits can concentrate remains from different animals. Fine sediments can preserve delicate plant material, but rivers also mix evidence. A bone may be moved before burial. A skull may separate from the body. A track surface may be erased by the next flood. Standing in those modern badlands, it is easy to see the rock as stillness, but every layer was motion when it formed. Water carrying sand, mud settling in pools, logs floating after storms, animals walking across damp flats, carcasses rolling in channels. The Triassic Takeover is recorded in these motions because the animals were not living on a stage. They were living inside sedimentary systems that decided what we would later know. Dinosaurs in North America would become far more prominent after the Triassic, but their late Triassic presence matters because it shows them entering northern ecosystems before the final extinction opened the field. They were already there when the old order began to fail. They did not have to arrive after the catastrophe. They only had to survive it better than many of their competitors. This is one of the most important differences between an origin story and a takeover story. Dinosaurs originated before they dominated. They spread before they ruled. They shared landscapes with animals that could outnumber, outsize, or outcompete them in particular places. Their future depended on being present when opportunity came. In the Triassic, presence was already a major achievement. The petrified trees of the Chinle do not speak directly about dinosaurs, but they frame them. They show the forests, floods, and seasons of a continent where the balance had not yet settled. Beneath those stone trunks and beside those ancient channels, the first dinosaur steps in North America were part of a crowded soundscape. Water, insects, amphibians, armored bodies, jaws in the shallows, and narrow-footed animals passing quickly through the dust. Far to the south of the old supercontinent, in regions that are now separated by oceans, the early dinosaur story continues through related bones and matching ages. Africa, India, South America, and other parts of Gondwana were joined in the Triassic, and their fossil records speak across the later fractures. A dinosaur found in Zimbabwe, a sauropodomorph from Argentina, a trackway in South Africa, a fragment in India, each belongs to a land that was once part of the same continuous world. This southern pattern is one reason many researchers look toward Gondwana when thinking about dinosaur origins. The oldest clear dinosaur fossils cluster in parts of the southern supercontinent, though the exact birthplace remains uncertain and may lie in regions where the right rocks are still poorly sampled. Deserts, jungles, politics, erosion, and simple chance all affect what has been found. The origin point of dinosaurs may still be hidden under modern soil or vegetation. Scientific maps of origin are always provisional. They are built from known fossils, and known fossils are not the same as all fossils that ever existed. A region without early dinosaur bones may truly have lacked dinosaurs, or it may simply lack exposed rocks of the right age and environment. This is especially important for the Triassic, where the earliest parts of the dinosaur record are patchy, and the animals were often small. In southern Africa, late Triassic and earliest Jurassic rocks preserve sauropodomorphs that show how successful the lineage became before and after the boundary. Some forms remained relatively modest, others became large enough to foreshadow the giants of later times. Their bones occur in ancient environments shaped by rivers, seasonal climates, and broad basins that connected with the rest of Gondwana in ways now obscured by continental drift. India also holds important Triassic dinosaur and sauropodomorph records, though many fossils from older collections have complicated histories. Taxonomy has changed as researchers re-examine material, compare it with new discoveries, and refine relationships. This is normal for early dinosaur fossils. The closer a specimen sits to the base of major lineages, the more likely it is to carry combinations of traits that make classification difficult. A fossil from Triassic India or Southern Africa can change more than a local species list. It can alter how we understand dispersal routes across Gondwana. It can show whether sauropodomorphs or theropods had reached certain regions by a particular time. It can reveal whether similar body plans evolved in parallel or spread from shared ancestors. The bones are regional, but the questions are continental. Imagine a herd-like gathering of sauropodomorphs near a southern river, though we should use that word carefully. Their long necks move through low conifer branches. Juveniles keep closer to cover. Adults lift their heads at distant movement. The ground is marked by wide feet and tail traces from other reptiles. In the heat, water is the center of everything, drawing animals from open woodland and dry scrub into temporary proximity. Whether early sauropodomorphs moved in true social groups remains uncertain, but some fossil accumulations and trackways raise the possibility of repeated association. Even without complex herding, animals may gather where resources concentrate. A shrinking waterhole can bring together individuals that spend the rest of the year apart. A productive floodplain can support many herbivores in overlapping ranges. Grouping does not always require deep social structure. Larger sauropodomorphs such as Rheogosaurus and Lesomsaurids show that by the late Triassic, some dinosaur herbivores had reached impressive sizes. These animals were not yet true sauropods in the classic Jurassic sense, but they pushed the lineage toward greater mass. Stronger limbs, longer necks, and more plant-dependent feeding. The path to gigantism began before the Jurassic, in bodies still carrying Triassic proportions. Size changed the physics of life. A larger animal retains heat differently, moves differently, feeds differently, and faces different predation risks. A small dinosaur can dart through brush. A large sauropodomorph has to plan movement around terrain, water, and available food. Its trails become more visible. Its carcass becomes a resource for scavengers. Its bones are more likely to fossilize than those of small animals, which partly shapes our view of the past. The first large dinosaur herbivores also changed the meaning of predator danger. A Rauisuchian or large theropod might threaten a juvenile. A healthy adult, though not invulnerable, was a more difficult target. Kicks, body mass, tail movement, and simple strength could make an attack costly. Predators do not want heroic battles. They want meals that do not break their bones. Across southern Pangaea, these interactions would have varied with habitat. Open basins favored visibility and movement. Forested river margins offered cover but also ambush. Seasonal floodplains could become rich feeding grounds, and then dangerous mud. The same animal might experience abundance and stress within 1 year, depending on rain. Fossils compress these cycles into layers, but the living animals experience them day by day. The southern dinosaur record also hints at the importance of endurance through geography. Pangaea gave lineages room to expand, but it also stretched populations across huge distances. As animals spread, local conditions shaped them. Over time, separated populations diverged. Some became distinct species, some died out, some fed back into wider dispersals when climates shifted. The continent was one landmass, but evolution still made regional histories. There is something powerful about restoring those connections. A bone found in Argentina, a footprint in South Africa, a fossil from India, and a specimen from Zimbabwe can all be placed back onto a Triassic map where the spaces between them shrink. The modern world teaches separation. The Triassic teaches continuity. Dinosaurs rose within that continuity, moving through corridors that no longer exist. This does not mean the takeover had a single center or a single route. It was more like a spreading pattern in wet sediment following channels of opportunity. One basin preserves the earliest clear predators. Another preserves herbivores growing larger. Another preserves close relatives that complicate the definition of Dinosauria itself. The whole story is distributed across Pangaea, and no one fossil locality owns it. On the southern floodplain, evening lowers the heat. A long-necked dinosaur pulls at leaves near the river, while smaller animals move between root shadows. Far away, on land that will one day become another continent, a related animal does the same. They are separated only by distance, not by oceans. Pangaea holds them both, and the dinosaur world is becoming wider than any one valley. A dinosaur skeleton is a set of solutions. Each bone answers a problem the animal faced, though not always in a way we immediately understand. The open hip socket, the upright limbs, the hinged ankle, the long balancing tail, the lightened skull, the grasping hand, the arrangement of muscle scars, none of these features alone explains the takeover. Together, they made a body that could do certain things very well. The upright limb posture was one of the most important. Many reptiles move with limbs angled outward from the body, a posture that works but carries the body differently. Dinosaurs and their close relatives brought the limbs beneath the body more directly. This changed the mechanics of walking and running. It reduced certain sideways stresses and allowed more efficient forward movement, especially over distance. On Pangaea, where water and food could be separated by broad, dry stretches, efficient movement mattered. The dinosaur hip socket, or acetabulum, became perforated, with the head of the femur fitting into an open structure that helped position the limb vertically. This is one of the classic skeletal features used in recognizing dinosaurs, though it evolved within a broader context of dinosauromorph anatomy. In practical terms, it was part of a locomotor system that kept the body lifted and the stride organized beneath it. Feet mattered as much as hips. Many early dinosaurs had narrow feet with weight carried primarily on 3 main toes. This concentrated movement into a light, forward-pointing step. The foot could grip, push, and release efficiently. Tracks preserve this anatomy in action. The toes press down first. The weight transfers. The animal lifts away. It seems simple, but millions of repeated steps across Pangaea made it one of the most successful walking designs in terrestrial history. Growth is another possible part of the dinosaur advantage. Studies of bone microstructure in many dinosaurs show relatively rapid growth compared with many living reptiles, though growth rates varied widely among lineages and through time. Faster growth can help young animals pass through vulnerable size ranges more quickly. It can also support larger adult bodies. In the Triassic, when predators and seasonal stress were constant, growth tempo may have influenced survival. Bone histology gives this evidence a strange intimacy. Thin sections cut from fossil bones can show growth marks, vascular patterns, and tissue organization. Under a microscope, the deep past becomes rings, canals, and textures. A femur is no longer only a support, it becomes a record of age, speed, stress, and season. The animal's life is written inside the material that carried it. Dinosaur metabolism remains a complex subject, especially for early forms. Many dinosaurs were likely more active than typical modern reptiles, and some lines show evidence consistent with elevated metabolic rates. But we should not imagine one simple switch from cold-blooded to warm-blooded. Physiology evolves in degrees. Early dinosaurs may have occupied a range of metabolic strategies shaped by body size, climate, behavior, and ancestry. Respiration may also have played a role. Later Saurischian dinosaurs show evidence of air sac systems related to the bird-style respiratory system, including pneumatic bones in many groups. How far back these features extend is still studied, but the broader archosaur respiratory story is important. Efficient breathing can support activity and large body size. In the Triassic, even partial steps towards such systems may have mattered, though the evidence varies among early lineages. None of these traits made dinosaurs immune to drought, injury, or predation. A good body plan still fails if the water disappears. A fast animal still dies if trapped in mud. A growing juvenile still starves if plant communities collapse. Evolutionary advantages are never shields against everything. They only tilt probabilities, generation after generation, until a lineage becomes more common than it used to be. Eggs were part of that probability. Dinosaurs reproduced by laying eggs, and although direct Triassic dinosaur nests are scarce compared with later records, the basic reproductive mode links them to a broader archosaur inheritance. Eggs allow multiple offspring, but they also create vulnerable stages. Shells can dry out, flood, crack, or attract predators. Nest sites have to balance moisture, temperature, and safety. Imagine a nesting site in the Triassic if such a place existed for one early dinosaur population. The ground is warm, but not too dry. Vegetation gives cover. Adults may or may not remain nearby, depending on the species. The eggs sit in sediment, each holding a small animal whose bones are still forming. Around them, insects move. Small reptiles investigate. Rain threatens to drown what heat threatens to desiccate. We know much more about dinosaur reproduction from later periods, especially Cretaceous nesting sites, eggshell fragments, embryos, and trackways of juveniles. Triassic evidence is thinner, so any reconstruction must remain cautious. But the vulnerability of eggs and hatchlings is universal. The takeover of Pangaea required not only adult survival, but successful reproduction in landscapes where seasons could be harsh. Juveniles may have lived differently from adults. In many animals, young individuals eat different foods, use different habitats, or move in different groups than mature animals. Early dinosaurs could have done the same. A young sauropodomorph could feed lower, hide more often, and avoid open spaces that adults crossed easily. A young theropod could hunt insects and tiny reptiles before graduating to larger prey. Ontogeny creates multiple ecological lives within one species. This matters because it expands the dinosaur presence in an ecosystem. A species is not just its adults. It includes eggs, hatchlings, juveniles, subadults, and senescent individuals, each interacting with the environment differently. Fossil assemblages that preserve multiple growth stages can reveal this, but many Triassic sites do not. The missing juveniles still existed, whether or not the rock kept them. The takeover was therefore anatomical, ecological, and reproductive at once. Dinosaurs had to move well, feed effectively, grow, reproduce, and survive enough local crises to persist. Their bodies provided tools. Pangaea provided scale. Climate provided tests. Competitors provided pressure. Extinction would later provide an opening. Only when all these factors overlapped did the dynasty become visible. Hold one fossil limb bone in mind. It is heavy in the hand, colored by minerals, broken at one end, smoothed by preparation. It once held muscle, blood, and marrow. It once lifted an animal over Triassic ground. The takeover of Pangaea passed through bones like this, not as an idea, but as repeated motion carried by living tissue. While dinosaurs were expanding across land, the rest of the Triassic world was changing around them. The seas were filling with marine reptiles, ammonoids, fish, and recovering reef systems. The skies held the first pterosaurs. Rivers held amphibians and phytosaurs. Mammal relatives moved in small, hidden roles. The dinosaur takeover did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a planet-wide reorganization of life after catastrophe. The oceans matter because they framed Pangaea. A single supercontinent meant one enormous surrounding ocean, Panthalassa, along with the Tethys Ocean, cutting into the eastern side of the landmass. Shallow seas spread in some regions and retreated in others. Marine reptiles evolved forms that would become more familiar in the Jurassic, but their Triassic experiments were already impressive. Ichthyosaurs appeared early and became fully aquatic. Other reptiles tested long necks, crushing teeth, and predatory bodies. On land, pterosaurs added a new dimension to archosaur success. By the late Triassic, vertebrates had entered powered flight. Early pterosaurs were not the giant winged animals of the Cretaceous. They were smaller, often long-tailed, with wings supported by an elongated fourth finger. Their presence means that when dinosaurs were still fighting for greater importance on the ground, close relatives had already opened the air. This matters for the dinosaur story because it shows that archosaurs were broadly successful, not only dinosaurs. The Triassic was an archosaur age in the widest sense. Crocodile-line animals ruled many land and freshwater niches. Pterosaurs took the skies. Dinosaur-line animals began their long rise on land. The greater group was exploring multiple habitats at once, and dinosaurs were one branch of that larger radiation. Early mammals, or mammaliaforms, also appeared by the late Triassic. They were small, likely nocturnal in many cases, and probably fed on insects and other small food sources. They were not competitors with large dinosaurs, but they were part of the same ecosystems. Their survival strategy was different: remain small, use darkness, rely on smell and hearing, and avoid the attention of larger archosaurs. At night, a Triassic floodplain would have changed. The heat of the day would leave the ground slowly. Insects would move. Small mammaliaforms might emerge from shelter. Early theropods may have hunted in twilight or darkness if their senses allowed it. Pterosaurs could roost in trees or cliffs. Large reptiles rested near water. The same landscape had different rulers depending on the hour. We should be careful not to make dinosaurs the only measure of success. For most of the Triassic, they were not the most diverse or dominant land vertebrates everywhere. Other groups were flourishing in their own right. This makes the eventual dinosaur dominance more interesting, not less. They did not rise because everything else was weak. They rose through a world full of strong alternatives. The skies, seas, and rivers also show how ecological opportunity can be divided. Dinosaurs never became marine animals in the way ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs did. They did not take flight in the Triassic the way pterosaurs did. Their great domain was terrestrial, walking, running, browsing, hunting, nesting, and later towering over land ecosystems. Pangaea was their arena, but not every part of the planet belonged to them. The limits are important. Dinosaurs conquered the land, not the sea. They shared the air with pterosaurs for much of the Mesozoic, and only one dinosaur lineage, birds, eventually made the sky its own. In the Triassic, that bird future had not yet appeared. Feathers may have already existed in some dinosaur line animals or close relatives, but powered dinosaur flight was still far away. Waterways remained dangerous boundaries. A river could carry a dinosaur carcass, erase footprints, or concentrate predators. A flood could bury bones and preserve them, or scatter them beyond recognition. Lakes could dry into cracked basins and then return with rain. The Triassic Takeover unfolded along these water systems because no land animal can ignore water, especially on a warm supercontinent with harsh interiors. The marine and aerial worlds also affected climate and geography indirectly through the broader Earth system. Sea levels, ocean chemistry, volcanic activity, and continental rifting would all matter at the end of the Triassic. The same planet that allowed dinosaurs to spread would soon impose another catastrophe. The land story and sea story meet at extinction boundaries, where atmospheric and oceanic change can reorganize life everywhere at once. Before that boundary, however, the Triassic world remained one of coexistence. Dinosaurs moved under pterosaurs, near mammalia forms, beside crocodilomorphs, around armored reptiles, within plant communities still rebuilding from ancient catastrophe. The takeover was visible, but incomplete. The old order still had teeth, armor, and numbers. This incomplete dominance is what gives the Triassic its tension. Later dinosaur ages can feel settled, at least by comparison. The Jurassic has giant sauropods and large theropods. The Cretaceous has hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, titanosaurs, tyrannosaurs, birds, and flowering plants. The Triassic is less settled. It is an age of alternatives where several futures seem possible, and only one of them will become the familiar dinosaur world. Beneath a Triassic sky, a small pterosaur lifts from a conifer branch as a theropod passes below. In the river, a phytosaur waits. In the undergrowth, a mammalia form pauses until the footsteps fade. None of these animals knows which lineage will become famous. The world is still deciding, and the decision will come through climate, extinction, survival, and time. By the late Triassic, the dinosaur signal becomes harder to ignore. It is still uneven, still regional, still interrupted by powerful non-dinosaur faunas, but the pattern has changed from the first rare bodies in southern basins. Sauropodomorphs have grown and spread. Theropods appear in multiple regions. Tracks cross surfaces far from the most famous skeletons. The group is no longer a small evolutionary note at the edge of the Archosaur story. The Norian Age, a long span in the later Triassic, gave dinosaurs time. Time is not passive in evolution. It allows populations to spread, isolate, adapt, and fail. It allows rare body plans to become ordinary. It allows climate belts to shift and open routes. It allows local extinctions to remove competitors in one basin, while others persist elsewhere. Over millions of years, small differences become large consequences. During this later Triassic interval, sauropodomorphs became some of the most widespread dinosaurs on Pangaea. Their fossils occur across Europe, South America, Southern Africa, and other regions. Some lineages grew larger and more heavily built. Others remained smaller. The group was experimenting with the balance between bipedal ancestry and increasing quadrupedal support, between flexible feeding and more committed herbivory. Theropods also persisted and diversified, though the largest predatory roles often remained contested by pseudopsuchians. Coelophysoids became widespread near the end of the Triassic and into the early Jurassic. Their light bodies and predatory habits proved durable. They were not the only hunters in their worlds, but they were good enough at being small to medium-sized carnivores that the lineage continued through the boundary that would erase many rivals. A late Triassic basin might therefore hold several dinosaur stories at once. A long-necked herbivore stripping foliage from low branches. A slender theropod moving along a stream. A smaller dinosauromorph, or possible ornithischian relative feeding near cover. A track surface recording animals whose bones are absent. The famous later dinosaur categories are beginning to separate, but the world around them remains deeply Triassic. It is easy to see the later giants inside these animals because we know what came after. But the living Triassic animals did not carry labels like ancestor or precursor. A sauropodomorph was not waiting to become a sauropod. A theropod was not practicing for Allosaurus. They were complete animals in their own ecosystems. Their importance to us comes from hindsight. Their importance to themselves was immediate survival. The Rhaetian, the final age of the Triassic, brought the world close to another boundary. Pangaea was beginning to rift in ways that would eventually open the Atlantic Ocean. Volcanism was building beneath the crust. Climate systems were vulnerable to disturbance. Ecosystems still contained many successful non-dinosaur groups, but the geological conditions that would destabilize them were assembling under the surface. Before that destabilization, dinosaurs had already achieved something essential. They were geographically widespread. A lineage cannot take advantage of a global or near-global crisis if it exists in only one small area. Dinosaurs were present across multiple regions when the end Triassic extinction struck. This distribution may have helped them survive because a crisis that devastates one habitat may leave refuges elsewhere. Survival at extinction boundaries is not only about being well adapted in ordinary times. It can depend on range size, diet flexibility, body size, reproductive rate, physiology, and luck. A widespread lineage has more chances. A lineage with small-bodied members may pass through bottlenecks more easily. A lineage able to use several food sources may persist when one collapses. Dinosaurs likely benefited from a combination of such factors, but no single explanation covers everything. The late Triassic also saw early crocodilomorphs becoming smaller and more gracile than many of their pseudopsuchian relatives. These animals would survive the end Triassic extinction and eventually give rise to the crocodilian line. Their persistence reminds us that dinosaurs were not the only winners. The catastrophe reshaped archosaur diversity. But it did not reduce the world to dinosaurs alone. Still, many major pseudopsuchian groups did not make it through. Phytosaurs vanished. Atosaurs disappeared. Several large predatory forms were lost. Their extinction removed animals that had held important roles in Triassic ecosystems for tens of millions of years. The disappearance of these groups opened space on land, especially for large herbivores and predators. Dinosaurs were already there to enter those spaces. This is the hinge of the takeover. Dinosaurs did not defeat every rival directly. Many rivals were removed by environmental catastrophe. That may seem to diminish the dinosaur achievement, but it makes the story more honest. Evolution is not a tournament with fair rules. The successful are often those that survive the wrong disaster at the right time. The phrase "dinosaurs conquered Pangaea" can sound like a campaign. The fossil record suggests something quieter and more contingent. They originated, spread, diversified, endured competition, survived climate instability, and then passed through an extinction that eliminated many of the animals limiting them. After that, the landscapes of the early Jurassic looked different. The dinosaur takeover became obvious only after the Triassic had done much of the selecting. A late Triassic dinosaur walking through a rift valley would have felt none of this. It would not know magma was moving below the crust. It would not know atmospheric chemistry could change enough to alter the future of its lineage. It would notice weather, hunger, scent, movement, thirst, heat. The mechanisms of global change were too large for any animal to perceive, even though they would decide which animals inherited the land. This is one reason deep time feels both vast and intimate. The causes can be planetary, rifting continents, volcanic provinces, greenhouse gases, ocean chemistry. The consequences occur in bodies: a predator lineage gone from a river, an herbivore failing to hatch, a dinosaur population surviving in a basin where conditions remain tolerable. The takeover of Pangaea happened at both scales at once. Near the end of the Triassic, the continent was still whole enough for animals to move across it, but already beginning to break. The future Atlantic was a weakness in the crust. The old reptile world still stood, but the ground beneath it was changing. Dinosaurs had become widespread enough to be present for what came next, and that presence would make all the difference. The end of the Triassic did not arrive as a single day of fire. It unfolded through geological processes that lasted far longer than a human lifetime, but were rapid enough to break ecosystems. Beneath central Pangaea, the crust was stretching. The supercontinent that had carried dinosaurs across the land was beginning to split. Along the rift zones, magma rose. What would become the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province began to form. This was not one volcano. It was a vast igneous province, a system of eruptions and intrusions spread across what are now eastern North America, northwestern Africa, parts of South America, and Europe. When the modern map is restored to its Triassic arrangement, these rocks line up around the future Atlantic. They are the cooled remains of a planetary scale wound opened during the first stages of Pangaea's breakup. Lava itself can bury landscapes, but the larger danger often comes from gases. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and other volcanic emissions can alter climate, acidify oceans, and stress life far from the eruption sites. Studies of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province suggest enormous releases of carbon dioxide, possibly reaching quantities large enough to drive severe warming and biosphere disruption. The atmosphere became part of the extinction mechanism. Sulfur gases could have produced shorter-term cooling by forming aerosols that reflected sunlight, while carbon dioxide drove longer-term warming. This combination can be especially damaging because it creates instability. Ecosystems adapted to one range of conditions are pushed toward another, then shocked again. Rainfall patterns shift. Heat stress increases. Plant communities change. Oceans absorb carbon dioxide and become more acidic. Food webs begin to loosen. The end Triassic extinction affected both land and sea. In the oceans, conodonts disappeared completely, and many marine invertebrate groups suffered serious losses. Reef systems were disrupted. Ammonoids declined, but would later recover. On land, many large non-dinosaur archosaurs vanished, including phytosaurs, atosaurs, and several important predatory pseudosuchian lineages. The old Triassic balance was broken. The boundary is not equally clear in every place, and scientists continue to refine the timing of eruptions, intrusions, climate signals, and biological losses. Some evidence suggests environmental stress began before the earliest preserved lava flows in certain regions, possibly linked to intrusive activity releasing gases before surface eruptions became widespread. The details remain active research, but the broad association between camp activity and the extinction is one of the central explanations. It is important not to make the catastrophe too simple. Mass extinctions rarely have one clean cause, even when one major trigger dominates. Volcanism can drive warming, cooling pulses, acid rain, wildfires, mercury pollution, ocean acidification, and anoxia. These stresses interact. One species may die because its food disappears, another because its eggs fail, another because heat exceeds tolerance, another because the chemistry of the sea changes faster than it can adapt. On land, the first effects may have been felt through plants. If rainfall patterns shifted and heat increased, vegetation zones would move or collapse. Herbivores dependent on particular plant communities would decline. Predators dependent on those herbivores would follow. Small generalists might endure. Animals with broad ranges might find refuges. The extinction would not look like one uniform death wave. It would look like local failures accumulating into global transformation. Imagine a Triassic river valley under a sky dimmed by volcanic haze. The sun still rises, but the light is altered. Rain falls with different chemistry. Floods come at unfamiliar times. Dry seasons sharpen. Plants that once held the banks thin out. Carcasses appear where drought concentrates animals. In the distance, a fissure eruption is not visible, but its gases have already entered the world. Dinosaurs were not untouched by this crisis. Some Triassic dinosaur lineages disappeared. Early diversity was pruned. Local populations would have failed. The animals that survived did not do so because dinosaurs as a whole were immune to environmental stress. They survived because enough dinosaur lineages had traits, ranges, body sizes, or habitats that allowed them to pass through the bottleneck. Smaller body size may have helped some dinosaurs and early crocodilomorphs. Smaller animals generally require less food and can use smaller shelters. Faster reproduction can help populations recover after disturbance. Dietary flexibility may have helped some theropods in omnivorous forms. Widespread distribution may have protected sauropodomorphs and theropods from total loss. These are probabilities, not guarantees, but in extinction events, probabilities become destiny. The disappearance of phytosaurs alone changed freshwater and river margin ecosystems. These animals had held crocodile-like predatory roles across much of the late Triassic. When they vanished, aquatic and semi-aquatic niches did not remain empty forever. But the immediate restructuring would have been profound. Crocodilomorphs survived in smaller forms and would later diversify. Dinosaurs, mainly terrestrial, benefited more from the removal of large land competitors. The loss of atosaurs and other armored herbivores opened plant-eating space. The loss of large pseudosuchian predators opened carnivore space. Sauropodomorphs and theropods were already present, already geographically widespread, already capable of occupying some of those roles. After the extinction, they did not have to invent themselves from nothing. They had to expand into a world where many old restrictions had vanished. This is why the end Triassic extinction is central to the title. The takeover of Pangaea was not completed when dinosaurs first evolved. It was not completed when they first spread. It was completed when a catastrophe removed many of their strongest competitors and left dinosaur lineages standing across enough of the supercontinent to radiate in the aftermath. There is no fairness in this. Phytosaurs were successful. Atosaurs were successful. Large pseudosuchian predators were successful. Their disappearance was not a moral failure or a simple proof that dinosaurs were better. It was the outcome of environmental stress on a scale no animal could negotiate consciously. A lineage can be well adapted to its world and still lose when the world changes too quickly. At the boundary, the rocks do not show triumph, they show turnover, ash, lava, altered carbon signals, vanished fossils, changed communities. The animals that survived did not step into a clean new world. They stepped into a damaged one, with food webs broken and climates unsettled. But damaged worlds contain openings, and dinosaurs were among the survivors ready to fill them. After the extinction, the land did not become instantly full. It became open in a way it had not been for tens of millions of years. Ecological roles that once belonged to Triassic archosaurs were suddenly vacant or weakened. River margins had fewer phytosaurs, floodplains had lost armored herbivores. Large predatory pseudosuchians were gone from many systems. The survivors moved through landscapes that still carried the shapes of absence. A sauropodomorph in the earliest Jurassic would have found plant communities recovering under altered climates, competitors reduced, and open herbivore space waiting across many regions. This did not mean life became easy. Recovery after extinction is often unstable, but for lineages able to increase population size and diversify, instability can become opportunity. Dinosaurs had already practiced survival through a difficult Triassic. Now the barriers had changed. The early Jurassic saw dinosaurs become the dominant large land vertebrates in a way they had not been before. Sauropodomorphs gave rise to true sauropods, though the greatest giants would come later. Theropods expanded into predatory roles, left open by the disappearance of many large pseudosuchians. Ornithischians, still poorly known in the Triassic, began to appear more clearly in Jurassic ecosystems. The dinosaur age had begun in full. This is the moment where the word takeover finally fits, though even here it should be used carefully. Dinosaurs did not replace every animal. Crocodilomorphs survived. Mammals persisted. Pterosaurs flew overhead. Turtles, amphibians, lizards, and many other groups continued. But on land, for large-bodied ecological roles, dinosaurs became the central fact. The balance had shifted permanently until the end Cretaceous asteroid impact more than 130 million years later. The scale of that dominance is difficult to hold. From the earliest Jurassic through the Cretaceous, dinosaurs occupied continents that were drifting apart, climates that changed, plant worlds that transformed with the rise of flowers, and ecosystems that produced giants, armored forms, horned forms, duck-billed herds, feathered hunters, and birds. The foundation for all of that was laid in the Triassic, when small and medium animals survived long enough to inherit the aftermath. The true conquest of Pangaea, then, was not the conquest of a stable supercontinent. It was the conquest of a breaking one. As the Atlantic began to open, dinosaur lineages were already positioned across the land. The supercontinent gave them roots. Rifting created new provinces. Extinction removed rivals. The Jurassic would spread their descendants across landscapes that were no longer as connected as before. By the early Jurassic, formations in North America, Europe, Africa, and elsewhere show dinosaur communities that differ from late Triassic ones. Coelophysoid theropods remained important. Early sauropodomorphs continued, while true sauropod traits developed. Ornithischians began their long, initially modest rise. The old archosaur diversity had not vanished completely, but the land vertebrate hierarchy had reorganized around dinosaurs. A museum visitor may see the result as inevitable because the later skeletons are so large. A sauropod femur looks like an argument for destiny. A theropod skull looks like proof that dinosaurs were always meant to dominate. But the Triassic record resists that simplicity. For much of their early history, dinosaurs were not the obvious winners. Their victory becomes clear only after the losers are gone. This does not make dinosaurs passive beneficiaries. They had to be present, diverse enough, and adaptable enough to respond. An extinction can open a niche, but it cannot fill it. The lineage that fills it must already have the tools. Dinosaurs had those tools by the end of the Triassic: efficient locomotion, established herbivorous and carnivorous branches, wide distribution, reproductive capacity, and enough ecological flexibility to radiate. The earliest Jurassic world was not merely a continuation of the Triassic, it was a recovery landscape. Forests and floodplains had to stabilize after the climatic disruption. Marine ecosystems had to rebuild. Rivers kept moving sediment through rift basins. Volcanic rocks cooled and weathered. The atmosphere gradually shifted away from the most intense pulses of disturbance. In that recovering world, dinosaurs began turning survival into dominance. A theropod crossing an early Jurassic floodplain could now be among the largest predators in its environment. A sauropodomorph browsing near a river could belong to one of the most important herbivore lineages on land. The ecological space around them had changed. Predators and prey that once shaped their limits had vanished. The animals themselves may not have changed overnight, but the meaning of their bodies had. This is a powerful idea. Sometimes evolution changes because organisms evolve new forms. Sometimes it changes because the world around an existing form is rearranged. A body that was minor in one ecosystem can become central in another. The dinosaur body plan did not need to be invented after the extinction. It was already there, waiting inside living populations, ready to expand when the old architecture fell. The takeover of Pangaea therefore has two halves. The first is the Triassic rise, origin, dispersal, competition, and diversification. The second is the boundary aftermath, extinction, vacancy, radiation, and dominance. Separate them too sharply, and the story breaks. Without the long Triassic preparation, dinosaurs would not have been ready. Without the end Triassic extinction, their rise may have remained slower, more limited, or very different. In the early Jurassic, the supercontinent was still recognizable, but changing fast by geological standards. Rift valleys widened. New coastlines formed. Shallow seas entered basins. Populations that had once been connected began to diverge. Dinosaurs carried the legacy of the Triassic into this changing geography, and that legacy would produce different faunas in different regions as isolation increased. Every later dinosaur world carries a Triassic shadow. The Morrison sauropods owe something to the first sauropodomorphs that learned herbivory under Triassic skies. Jurassic theropods owe something to the slender predators that crossed late Triassic mudflats. Birds owe something to the theropod body plan established long before flight. Even the dominance of dinosaurs itself owes something to competitors that held them back until catastrophe changed the rules. When the earliest Jurassic sun rose over the recovering land, there was no announcement that a new age had begun. Animals moved because they were hungry. Plants grew where conditions allowed. Rivers cut new channels, but in the composition of the fauna, in the absence of old groups and the expansion of survivors, the world had changed. The dinosaurs had passed through the gate. The evidence for this transformation does not come from one place. It comes from badlands, quarries, museum drawers, track surfaces, thin sections, and geochemical signals measured in rocks that do not contain a single dinosaur bone. The takeover is a mosaic. One piece shows anatomy, another shows climate, another shows extinction, another shows a footprint where a skeleton is missing. The full picture appears only when all these pieces are allowed to speak together. A mounted dinosaur skeleton can make the past feel solid, but the scientific story behind it is usually less complete. Many Triassic dinosaurs are known from partial remains. A pelvis may be enough to identify a lineage. A jaw can show diet. A few vertebrae can suggest body size. A single hind limb can reveal posture. Paleontologists often work with fragments because fragments are what deep time offers. Radiometric dating, magnetostratigraphy, biostratigraphy, and sedimentology help place those fragments in time. The age of a fossil matters as much as its shape. A dinosaur from 231 million years ago means something different from a similar dinosaur near 203 million years ago. The difference is not just numbers, it is ecological context. Before or after certain climate events, before or after certain competitors declined, before or after the rifting of Pangaea intensified. Geochemistry adds another layer. Carbon isotope excursions can signal changes in the global carbon cycle. Mercury anomalies can point toward volcanic activity. Sedimentary evidence can record ocean anoxia or acidification. These signals may seem far from dinosaurs, but they explain the world that shaped dinosaur survival. A theropod tooth and a carbon isotope curve can belong to the same story, even if they are preserved in very different rocks. The challenge is correlation. Events in deep time often have uncertainties in dating, and rock records can be incomplete. A lava flow in one region, an extinction horizon in another, and a climate signal in a third must be aligned with care. Scientists debate the exact timing because the difference of a few tens of thousands of years can matter. In human terms, that is enormous. In geological terms, it can be a narrow boundary. The public version of dinosaur history often prefers clear scenes, an eruption, an extinction, a survivor, a new age. The actual evidence is more patient. It asks whether the fossil disappears before or after the geochemical signal. It asks whether the absence is real or caused by missing rock. It asks whether a group declined gradually or vanished abruptly. These questions make the story less simple and more trustworthy. The end Triassic extinction is one of the major mass extinctions of the Phanerozoic, though it was not as severe as the end Permian event. Its importance for dinosaurs lies in selectivity. Some groups were hit hard, others passed through. Dinosaurs were among the survivors that expanded afterward. This pattern appears across enough data to make the connection strong, even while details remain under study. Museums often separate specimens by period, but the Triassic-Jurassic boundary does not obey display cases. A Triassic theropod and an early Jurassic theropod may look related because they are. A late sauropodomorph and an early sauropod may show continuity across the boundary. The extinction did not erase the dinosaur line and replace it with something new. It filtered the existing lineages and changed the ecosystems around them. This filtering is colder than the word victory. An animal survives while another dies, but not because the survivor understands the event. A small population persists in one basin while a larger, more impressive animal vanishes elsewhere. A lineage with a broad diet makes it through a season of collapse. Another lineage, specialized and successful for millions of years, loses the conditions it needs. The rock records the outcome, not the suffering. There is also humility in the fossil record. Many animals that mattered ecologically may be poorly known because their bones were small, fragile, or lived in places unlikely to fossilize. Some dinosaur lineages may have expanded earlier than we can prove. Others may have seemed important locally and left almost no trace. The takeover we reconstruct is real, but it is reconstructed from a record with silences. Those silences are not empty. They guide research. A missing early Ornithischian record asks where to look next. Sparse tropical dinosaur fossils raise questions about climate barriers. The uneven distribution of Triassic dinosaurs forces scientists to test whether absence reflects ecology or sampling. Every gap becomes a map of future work. The story continues to change as new fossils are found. A small silesaurid from Brazil can reopen questions about dinosaur origins. A new early dinosaur from Africa can shift ideas about distribution. Reanalysis of old museum material can move a species from one branch to another. The Triassic Takeover is not a finished chapter sealed in stone. It is a scientific problem still being revised. That ongoing revision fits the period itself. The Triassic was a time of unsettled ecosystems, unsettled climates, unsettled lineages. Our understanding of it is unsettled too. This does not weaken the story. It makes the story alive in the scientific sense, still responsive to evidence. The dinosaurs conquered Pangaea, but we are still learning what conquest looked like when it happened slowly enough to be hidden in layers. In a museum drawer, a small bone rests beside a paper label. It may not impress visitors, it may not appear in posters or films, but if it comes from the right layer, if its shape preserves the right feature, it can change the timing of a lineage. The Triassic Takeover is held not only in famous skeletons, but in these quiet fragments, waiting for someone to ask the right question. To make the takeover visible, it helps to follow one Triassic year, not because one year explains 50 million, but because evolution is built from ordinary seasons. The dry months tighten around a basin. Water withdraws into channels and pools. Ferns yellow at the edges. Dust collects on conifer needles. Tracks overlap near the remaining mud because every animal, large or small, has to return to water. A small theropod moves in the morning before the heat becomes punishing. Its body is narrow enough to slip through low vegetation. It pauses often, head tilted, watching movement among roots. It is not hunting giants, It is looking for small animals, lizards, insects, young reptiles, perhaps carrion left by something larger. Its survival depends on modest meals taken often enough to keep the body moving. Nearby, a juvenile sauropodomorph feeds at the edge of cover. It is tall enough to reach leaves beyond the smallest herbivores, but still small enough to be at risk. Its limbs are strong, but not yet massive. It lifts its head when shadows shift. The adults may be somewhere farther along the river, or perhaps there are no adults nearby at all. The fossil record rarely tells us who stayed with whom. As the day warms, larger reptiles approach the water. An dinosaur lowers its armored body through mud, its back plates catching light. A phytosaur lies almost invisible near the bank. A cynodont or early mammaliaform remains hidden, waiting for darkness. Pterosaurs rest above the channel. The dinosaurs are present, but the scene is not theirs alone. It belongs to a crowded community shaped by thirst. Then the rain returns. In some years it may return gently. In others it arrives as a hard wall of water, turning dry channels into sudden rivers. Mud surfaces vanish under flood. Eggs are drowned in low nests. Burrows collapse. Carcasses lift and move. Logs are carried from upstream. Sediment spreads across prints made only hours earlier, preserving some and erasing most. After the flood, new plants grow. Insects multiply. Herbivores feed intensely while food is abundant. Predators follow the young animals that hatched or emerged with the wet season. A theropod that survived the dry months finds more prey. A sauropodomorph stores energy as body mass. The year opens, then narrows again. Over many generations, lineages that match this rhythm gain ground. Seasonal environments can favor mobility and flexibility. Animals that can move between resource patches tolerate variation. And reproduce successfully despite unstable conditions may do better than animals tied tightly to one habitat. Dinosaurs were not the only animals with such abilities, but their posture, growth, and dietary diversity may have helped them navigate a world where abundance and scarcity alternated sharply. A single drought can kill individuals. Repeated droughts shape evolution. A lineage that can survive the average year but fails in extreme years will decline over time. The Triassic, with its strong seasonality and climate shifts, repeatedly tested the margins of survival. Dinosaurs passed enough of these tests to keep expanding, while other groups passed them too, until the final crisis changed the scale. We cannot assign every success to adaptation. Luck remains present at every level. A population may survive because its valley received rain when another did not. A nest may hatch because it sat slightly higher on a bank. A carcass may fossilize because a flood arrived before scavengers. Evolution is governed by selection, but the evidence we study is also governed by chance preservation. This is why the takeover should feel physical rather than abstract. It happened through heat, mud, hunger, rainfall, and the timing of floods. It happened when a dinosaur found enough food to grow through a season, when a juvenile avoided a river predator, when eggs survived in sediment, when a population moved into a basin where competitors were fewer. Grand evolutionary patterns are made from small survivals. Over thousands of such years, then millions, dinosaur populations became part of more landscapes. A theropod lineage persisted in one basin and spread to another. Sauropodomorphs became more common in southern and northern regions. Trackways increased. Bones accumulated. The world did not notice a takeover, but the fossil record did. The animals themselves lived inside immediate needs. A Plateosaurus did not know it represented herbivore expansion. A Coelophysis did not know it belonged to a lineage that would one day produce birds. A small early ornithischian relative, if present in the undergrowth, did not know its descendants would include armored, horned, and duck-billed dinosaurs. The future is visible only from the far side of time. That distance can make the Triassic feel like preparation for the Jurassic, but it was not merely preparation. It was a complete world, with its own balances, tragedies, and successes. The dinosaur takeover matters because of what came later, but the animals that made it happen lived fully within the Triassic. Their lives were not prologues. They were lives. Evening settles after the rains. The mud is fresh again. Prints cross the bank in several directions: broad, narrow, clawed, padded, three-toed, sprawling. By morning, some will be gone. A few will be buried. One of them may survive long enough to become evidence that dinosaurs were here, not yet ruling everything, but returning to the water with all the other animals of Pangaea. Of the three great dinosaur futures, the quietest in the Triassic may be the Ornithischian one. Later, Ornithischians would become astonishingly diverse: stegosaurs with plates, ankylosaurs with armor, ceratopsians with horns and frills, hadrosaurs with complex teeth, and many smaller herbivores filling forests and plains. Yet their earliest record is sparse, uncertain, and often debated. The branch that later became so visible begins almost invisibly. This invisibility has several possible explanations. Early Ornithischians may have been small, lightly built animals whose bones did not preserve well. They may have lived in environments not sampled by known fossil sites. They may have originated earlier than their clear fossil record suggests. Or some fossils currently assigned to close relatives, including certain silesaurids, may eventually prove to belong nearer to the Ornithischian line than once thought. None of these possibilities should be treated as settled without evidence. The early Ornithischian problem remains one of the important puzzles of dinosaur origins. But it matters for the takeover, because dinosaur dominance later depended on all three broad branches. Theropods supplied many predators and ultimately birds. Sauropodomorphs supplied giant herbivores. Ornithischians would later supply some of the most abundant plant eaters on Earth. In the Triassic, however, sauropodomorphs carried much of the visible herbivore expansion. Their larger bodies and more durable bones make them easier to find. A small Ornithischian ancestor could have lived in the same region and left no clear fossil, while a sauropodomorph femur would survive as a recognizable statement. Preservation can make one lineage look louder than another. Theropods, by contrast, are visible earlier because predatory dinosaurs leave distinctive teeth, limb bones, and trackways. Their skulls and jaws carry features tied to carnivory. Their feet produce recognizable traces. Even fragmentary remains can often be assigned with some confidence, though early forms still create classification problems. Their Triassic story is not complete, but it is clearer than that of early Ornithischians. The sauropodomorph story is clearer still in some regions because of size and abundance. Plateosaurus bone beds, South American forms, Southern African records, and other finds show a lineage that was becoming ecologically important before the boundary. This matters because herbivore dominance underwrites predator dominance. Large carnivores cannot become common unless there is enough prey biomass to support them. The future Jurassic system, with large theropods hunting or scavenging around sauropods and other herbivores, has its roots in these Triassic experiments. The scale was smaller. The players were different, but the basic structure was forming. Dinosaur herbivores converting plant productivity into animal mass, dinosaur carnivores taking advantage of that mass directly or indirectly, and smaller animals filling the spaces around them. A Triassic ecosystem with sauropodomorphs and theropods already contains the outline of later dinosaur worlds, but it still has phytosaurs in the rivers, atosaurs on land, and large pseudosuchian predators. That mixture is the Triassic signature. It is not yet the clean dinosaur-dominated picture of later times. It is a layered world, with old and new forms sharing the same ground. The end Triassic extinction stripped away many of those older layers. What had been one thread in a complex fabric became the main pattern. Sauropodomorphs and theropods did not need to change identity to become more important. Their context changed. The fabric around them tore, and the surviving thread spread across the gap. This is why the dinosaur takeover cannot be explained only by one adaptation. Upright posture matters. Growth matters. Climate matters. Geographic spread matters. Extinction matters. Diet matters. Chance matters. Remove any one of these and the story changes. The rise of dinosaurs was not a single key fitting a single lock. It was a ring of keys, and the lock kept changing. Paleontology is often strongest when it resists tidy answers. Dinosaurs conquered Pangaea because they were already widespread by the late Triassic, because some lineages were adaptable, because major competitors disappeared, because climate and geography opened routes, because their bodies worked well in the aftermath, and because extinction is selective in ways that no living animal can plan for. That answer is less simple, but closer to the rock. The living legacy of this Triassic branching is easy to miss because only one dinosaur lineage survives today. Birds are theropods, and every bird carries the long history of bipedal dinosaur ancestry, feathers, air sacs, eggs, and skeletal transformation. The sauropodomorphs are gone. The non-avian ornithischians are gone. But the dinosaur tree did not vanish completely. One branch survived into morning bird song. That survival makes the Triassic more than a prelude to extinction. It is also a beginning that never fully ended. The first small dinosaurs of Pangaea are separated from modern birds by more than 200 million years, but they belong to the same deep continuity. A track in Triassic mud and a bird footprint in modern snow are not the same thing, yet they are connected by anatomy, descent, and time. In the Triassic, that future was still hidden. Feathers, if present in some early dinosaur relatives, were not yet wings carrying birds through forests. Ornithischians had not yet become armored or horned giants. Sauropodomorphs had not yet become the largest land animals in history. The world held only the first versions, moving through conifers and red mud, while Pangaea kept them close enough for the takeover to spread. Pangaea did not break in a way any animal could see. The rifts began as geological weaknesses, basins opening slowly, faults shifting, volcanic rocks intruding through older crust. To a living dinosaur, the world still looked like land, river, forest, dry plain, shoreline. But beneath those ordinary surfaces, the supercontinent was beginning to separate into futures that would eventually become the Atlantic and the continents of the later Mesozoic. The irony is that dinosaurs conquered Pangaea just as Pangaea was beginning to stop being whole. Their rise depended partly on the connectedness of the land, yet their later diversity would be shaped by the loss of that connection. Once populations became isolated on drifting landmasses, evolution could push them in different directions. The Jurassic and Cretaceous dinosaur worlds were born from both unity and separation. During the Triassic, connected land allowed dispersal across enormous distances when climates permitted. During the Jurassic, rifting began to divide those populations more strongly. During the Cretaceous, continental separation and sea level changes created regional faunas with their own distinctive dinosaur communities. The takeover of Pangaea was therefore the opening act of a longer geographic transformation, one that turned a single reptile-dominated world into many dinosaur provinces. This matters because dominance is not only about numbers, it is also about resilience across changing geography. Dinosaurs were able to persist as Pangaea rifted, as climate belts shifted, as sea levels rose, and as plant communities eventually transformed. Their Triassic foundation gave them enough diversity to survive into new continental arrangements. A narrow lineage might have ruled briefly and vanished. Dinosaurs became broad enough to continue changing. Think of the later Mesozoic as a long echo of Triassic survival. Sauropods in Jurassic floodplains, stegosaurs under conifer forests, allosaurs hunting along rivers, Cretaceous titanosaurs nesting on southern continents, tyrannosaurs crossing northern coastal plains, hadrosaurs chewing flowering plants with dental batteries, birds flying over the ruins of every old boundary. All of it begins with small Triassic animals that were not yet dominant, but were already durable. The title says takeover, but the deeper word may be inheritance. Dinosaurs inherited opportunities created by extinction. They inherited body plans shaped by earlier archosaurs. They inherited Pangaea's connected geography. They inherited the consequences of rifting and volcanism. Then, they transformed that inheritance into more than 130 million years of terrestrial dominance. The Triassic did not simply hand them the world. It handed them a damaged, changing world, and they made it theirs. By the time the Jurassic was underway, the basic public image of dinosaur dominance had finally become accurate in broad terms. Dinosaurs were the primary large animals on land. Sauropodomorphs and sauropods occupied major herbivore roles. Theropods were central predators. Ornithischians, though still not as spectacular as later, were part of the expanding picture. The age of dinosaurs had begun not at their origin, but after their ecological release. This distinction helps correct a common misunderstanding. Dinosaurs did not rule from the moment they appeared. For tens of millions of years, they lived alongside and often under the shadow of other reptiles. Their rise was delayed, contested, and contingent. The Triassic was not a simple opening chapter with dinosaurs already in charge. It was the difficult apprenticeship of a lineage that would become dominant only after surviving a world that kept testing it. Even after the end Triassic extinction, dominance was not permanent in the sense of safety. Dinosaur communities would face climate shifts, sea level changes, regional extinctions, volcanic events, competition, and eventually the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous. The lesson of the Triassic is not that dinosaurs became invincible, it is that they became successful under certain conditions, and success in deep time always remains vulnerable to planetary change. The same vulnerability had eliminated their competitors. That fact gives the dinosaur rise a sober edge. The animals that vanished at the end of the Triassic were not failed designs. They were part of thriving ecosystems until the conditions changed. Dinosaurs benefited from their disappearance, but a later catastrophe would do something similar to most dinosaurs themselves. Deep time repeats no event exactly, but it often repeats the pattern of winners made by loss. For now, in the early Jurassic aftermath, the losses favored dinosaurs. A predator lineage became freer to grow. Herbivores became freer to diversify. Smaller groups found niches beneath the expanding dinosaur canopy. Crocodilomorphs survived in altered roles. Mammals remained small. Pterosaurs continued overhead. The land had been reorganized around dinosaurs, and for the first time, that arrangement would persist. Pangaea's breakup then carried dinosaur dominance outward. As land masses drifted, dinosaur faunas diverged. Some lineages became isolated and unique, others spread through remaining connections. The initial takeover of one supercontinent gave way to regional histories on separating continents. The dinosaur age was not one static empire. It was a long series of evolving ecosystems descended from a Triassic threshold. That threshold is easy to miss because the Triassic lacks some of the familiar icons. There is no Tyrannosaurus, no Triceratops, no Diplodocus, no Velociraptor. But the absence of those names is the point. The Triassic is where the conditions for them were assembled. It is where the dinosaur body first proved itself against competitors. It is where survival preceded spectacle. If the Jurassic is the age when dinosaurs became unmistakable, the Triassic is the age when they became possible. Possible as predators, possible as large herbivores, possible as widespread lineages, possible as survivors of catastrophe. The takeover of Pangaea was not the final form of dinosaur success. It was the moment the door opened, and enough dinosaurs were standing on the right side of it. The names of Triassic dinosaurs can feel less familiar because many of them sit near beginnings rather than peaks. Herrerasaurus, Eoraptor, Pangaea, Saturnalia, Embyrosaurus, Plateosaurus, Rheogosaurus, Coelophysis. They do not all belong to the same branch or the same exact moment, and some have histories of debate around their classification. But together they form a scattered cast of early dinosaur life, spread across Pangaea before dominance became obvious. Saturnalia, from Brazil, was a small early sauropodomorph, lightly built compared with later relatives, and close to the early stages of the lineage. It helps show that the path to giant herbivores began with modest animals that still retained many primitive features. Ambirosaurus, from Zimbabwe, is another early dinosaur from southern Pangaea. Important for understanding where early dinosaurs lived and how climate may have shaped their distribution. Each new form adds detail to the first spread. These animals were separated by geography and time, but they share a broader pattern. Early dinosaurs were often small to medium-sized, frequently bipedal, and still only part of complex communities. Over the late Triassic, sauropodomorphs became larger and more widely distributed, while theropods remained effective predators at modest sizes. The first steps toward later dinosaur ecosystems were visible, but not yet complete. Coelophysis, preserved so abundantly at Ghost Ranch, gives the theropod side a clear body. Plateosaurus gives the sauropodomorph side mass and abundance. Herrerasaurus gives the early predatory radiation a more archaic, powerful shape. Euraptor and Pangaea sit near difficult roots. These animals are not interchangeable, but they all belong to the same larger transformation, dinosaurs becoming more than rare archosaurs. The fossil record also shows that dinosaur success was not only about single species, it was about lineages. A single famous animal can capture attention, but a takeover requires branching. It requires multiple species in different places, different diets, different sizes, different tolerances. By the end of the Triassic, dinosaurs had enough branches to respond when ecosystems opened. That branching is one of the clearest signs that the group had become evolutionarily prepared. A branch can remain small for a long time. It can survive in low diversity, occupy narrow roles, and then expand rapidly when conditions change. This is common in evolutionary history. The fossil record often shows lineages waiting in the background, though waiting is only our word. They are not waiting. They are living within limits until the limits move. The limits moved violently at the end of the Triassic. When they did, the old dominance of many pseudosuchian groups collapsed. Dinosaurs did not need to erase them through direct competition. Extinction did what competition had not. Afterward, the survivors were sorted into a new landscape of possibility. The dinosaur lineages that remained could radiate into space made by loss. This sequence can feel uncomfortable because it denies a simple heroic rise. Dinosaurs were not destined monarchs. They were survivors of a ruthless filtering. They were shaped by advantages, but also by timing. They benefited from catastrophe, just as mammals would later benefit from the asteroid that ended most dinosaur lineages. Deep time often advances through openings made by destruction. That does not make the dinosaur story random. Adaptations mattered. Distribution mattered. Ecology mattered. If dinosaurs had not already diversified, the end Triassic extinction would not have made them dominant. If they had remained restricted to one small region, they might have vanished. If sauropodomorphs and theropods had not already established viable ways of life, vacant niches would have been filled by other survivors. Chance opened the door, but dinosaurs had to be capable of walking through it. The metaphor of walking is appropriate because so much of the evidence comes back to movement. Long limbs under bodies, narrow feet in mud, strides across rift basins, generations spreading across connected land. The dinosaur takeover was not only an ecological pattern, it was a geographic one, written by animals moving through Pangaea before oceans divided their descendants. We can reconstruct that movement only imperfectly. We have fossils where rocks were exposed, where sediment preserved bones, where collectors looked, where preparation revealed diagnostic features. Vast areas of Triassic Pangaea remain poorly known. The Sahara, the Amazon, parts of Antarctica, and many other regions may hold key evidence or may have lost it to erosion and burial. The map of early dinosaur history is still incomplete. The incompleteness should not frustrate the story into silence. It should make the story more exact. We can say what is known, mark what is uncertain, and still let the animals live in the narration. We know Pangaea was one supercontinent. We know dinosaurs appeared and diversified during the Triassic. We know they were not dominant at first. We know many competitors vanished at the end of the period. We know dinosaurs expanded afterward. Between those facts lies the living world. A fossil cannot preserve the nervous attention of a small theropod. It cannot preserve the heat rising from red mud, or the smell of resin after rain, or the sound of a river cutting under its bank. But it gives enough structure for careful imagination. The task is not to invent a fantasy over the fossils, but to restore the space around them. A three-toed print, a jaw with serrated teeth, a sauropodomorph femur, a plate of atasaur armor, a phytosaur skull, a conifer trunk turned to stone. These objects do not compete. They belong together. They are the pieces of the world dinosaurs had to enter, and the world that had to change before dinosaurs could rule. Near the end of the Triassic, the world held two truths at once. Dinosaurs had spread far enough to matter, and they were still not the only answer to life on land. Their tracks crossed mud beside the tracks of other reptiles. Their bones lay in deposits with animals that would soon vanish. Their future was enormous, but their present was uncertain. That uncertainty is what makes the moment worth watching. A late Triassic theropod could move through a rift valley where the first signs of Pangaea's breakup were recorded not in open chasms, but in subsiding basins and volcanic intrusions deep below. A sauropodomorph could feed under conifers, while atmospheric gases were beginning to shift on scales no animal could sense. A phytosaur could still dominate a river without knowing its lineage was near its end. The living world is always local, even when the causes of change are global. The takeover of Pangaea was completed only in retrospect. At no point did every dinosaur suddenly become more advanced than every competitor. Instead, dinosaur lineages survived a sequence of filters. They persisted through climate belts that limited their spread. They diversified through intervals of environmental change. They became widespread enough to avoid total loss. They passed through the end Triassic extinction, when many other archosaurs did not. Afterward, the same traits that had once allowed them to survive at the margins became traits that allowed expansion into the center. Efficient movement helped predators and herbivores move through recovering landscapes. Sauropodomorph feeding strategies became more important as large herbivore niches opened. Theropod predation became more central after the decline of large pseudosuchian hunters. The dinosaur body plan had been tested in a crowded world and then released into a reorganized one. This is why the Triassic is not merely the period before the Jurassic. It is the period that explains why the Jurassic could happen. Without Triassic origins, there are no Jurassic giants. Without Triassic dispersal, there is no broad dinosaur radiation. Without Triassic competition, there is no long testing ground. Without the end Triassic extinction, dinosaur dominance may have been delayed, reduced, or altered beyond recognition. The phrase dinosaur age often makes the Mesozoic feel unified, but the early Mesozoic was not unified at all. It began with recovery from the greatest extinction in Earth history. It passed through a world ruled by many reptile lineages. It watched dinosaurs appear as modest animals, then expand unevenly, then inherit the land after another crisis. The age of dinosaurs was born from instability, not from calm. That instability played out over time spans that overwhelm ordinary imagination. The entire history of agriculture, cities, writing, metal, empires, industry, and modern science fits into a sliver far smaller than a single Triassic stage. 1,000,000 years can hide countless generations. 10 million years can turn rare animals into common ones. 50 million years can remake the dominant life on land while mountains rise, rivers shift, and continents begin to tear. To us, the takeover becomes a narrative, Because we can compress it. We can move from the first dinosauromorphs to Herrerasaurus, from Plateosaurus to Coelophysis, from camp volcanism to early Jurassic dominance in a single hour of thought. The animals could not. They lived second by second, with no sense of the pattern. Evolution is visible only when the lives are stacked beyond counting. The pattern also warns against simple rankings. Dinosaurs were not better than pseudoseuchians in every way. They were not more worthy than phytosaurs or atosaurs. They were not destined by some internal law to rule. They were a successful lineage whose traits met a changing world at a decisive moment. That is a stronger explanation than destiny, because it can be tested against fossils, rocks, climate evidence, and extinction patterns. The same logic applies to their later fall. Most dinosaurs would vanish at the end of the Cretaceous, not because they had become failures, but because the world changed violently again. Birds survived, just as certain dinosaur lineages survived the Triassic. Mammals expanded afterward, just as dinosaurs expanded after the end Triassic extinction. Deep time does not protect its winners. It only records who survived the next turn. In the Triassic, dinosaurs survived the turn. The land they inherited was still scarred by volcanism and climate upheaval. Rivers still carried sediment through rift basins. Forests still lacked flowers. Mammals still kept to small roles. Pterosaurs still crossed the sky. Crocodilomorphs still persisted. But the great ecological space on land had shifted. The animals that would define the rest of the Mesozoic were now in position. A small detail can hold that whole transformation. A theropod tooth from a Triassic bed is not large, but it points to predation. A sauropodomorph limb bone points to herbivore mass. A trackway points to movement. A lava flow points to rifting. A carbon signal points to atmospheric disruption. None of these alone is the story. Together they show the passage from a world where dinosaurs were present to a world where dinosaurs mattered most. Pangaea itself would not remain a single stage for long. The Atlantic would continue to widen. Laurasia and Gondwana would become increasingly distinct. Seas would flood continental margins. New climates would form. Dinosaur lineages would be carried into isolation, and isolation would generate difference. The conquest of one supercontinent would become the diversification of many continents. But the memory of the Triassic remained inside every later dinosaur ecosystem. It remained in the upright stance of theropods, in the long-necked ambitions of sauropodomorphs, in the survivorship of small lineages, in the ecological openings created by extinction. The Jurassic did not erase the Triassic. It grew from it. Every later dinosaur footstep carries an older footstep beneath it. That is why the little track in red stone matters. It does not show a giant. It does not show a ruler. It shows an animal light enough to leave a delicate mark, strong enough to cross a floodplain, ordinary enough to be almost overlooked, yet it belongs to the lineage that would become the most extraordinary terrestrial radiation of the Mesozoic. The beginning of dominance can be small enough to fit in a hand. The Triassic takeover was slow enough that no living thing would have noticed it. A forest grew. A river shifted. A predator missed. An egg hatched. A drought killed. A population moved. A lineage survived. The pattern emerged only after millions of such moments accumulated, and the rocks held enough of them to be read. If you return one last time to the floodplain, the mud is beginning to dry. Conifer shadows stretch across the ground. Insects move over the surface. Far off, something larger breaks a branch. Near your feet, the small three-toed print is already losing moisture, its edges tightening under the heat. Another flood will have to come soon if it is to survive. The animal that made it is gone into the vegetation. It is not famous. It has no idea that its lineage will pass through fire, drought, rifting, extinction, and the long opening of a new world. It only moves forward, step after step, across Pangaea. The mud keeps one of those steps. The stone keeps the mud. And in that small preserved pressure, the age of dinosaurs begins to take the shape of a world. There is another way to read that print, not as a beginning, but as a threshold. Behind it lies the long recovery from the Permian extinction, the first archosaurs, the dry interiors of Pangaea, the wet intervals that loosened old boundaries, the crowded river systems where dinosaurs were only one presence among many. Ahead of it lies the extinction that will clear the land, the Jurassic expansion, and the long rule of dinosaur bodies across the continents. The threshold is thin because fossils are thin. A bedding plane may be only a few centimeters of rock, yet it can divide one environment from the next, one season from another, one preserved surface from total erasure. The Triassic-Jurassic boundary works in a similar way in the imagination. We draw it as a line, but the living transition was messy, regional, and uneven, with survivors carrying Triassic bodies into a Jurassic world. The animals did not change names at the boundary. A lineage that had been Triassic on one side became Jurassic on the other only because geologists later organized time that way. The bodies were continuous. The climate stress, extinctions, and ecological vacancies changed the meaning of those bodies. A sauropodomorph lineage that had been one herbivore among many could become a foundation for giant herbivore ecosystems. A theropod lineage that had been one predator among many could become central to terrestrial carnivory. This continuity is why the Triassic deserves attention on its own terms. It is not only the age before the icons, it is where the icons became possible through ordinary anatomy and extraordinary circumstance. The open hip socket, the long hind limb, the narrow foot, the growing gut, the predatory jaw, the egg, the juvenile, the population moving into the next basin. These are not decorations around the story. They are the story. Some details will change as science advances. The exact placement of certain early dinosaurs may shift. Silesaurids may be reinterpreted in ways that alter the origin of ornithischians. New fossils may move the oldest clear dinosaurs earlier, or reveal them in regions not yet represented. Climate models may refine the barriers and corridors of Pangaea. The takeover is a stable, broad pattern, but many of its internal paths remain open. That openness is not a weakness. It is what keeps the Triassic alive as a field of discovery. Every new quarry can add an animal to the map. Every old specimen can be scanned, sectioned, or compared in a new way. Every track surface can be remeasured. A period once treated mainly as a prelude has become one of the most important laboratories for understanding how dominance begins. The next fossil could be small. It might be a tooth no longer than a fingernail. It might be a partial ankle, or a jaw with just enough bone to show how the teeth sat. It might be a clutch of eggshell fragments, or a footprint that changes the known range of a lineage. In early dinosaur history, small discoveries can have continental consequences. Pangaea made those consequences larger. A local find can speak to dispersal across a supercontinent. A Brazilian dinosauromorph can illuminate African gaps. A North American trackway can show northern movement. A European sauropodomorph bonebed can reveal abundance in a region far from the earliest clear origins. The land was connected, and so the evidence remains connected even after the continents have drifted apart. The takeover of Pangaea was therefore never a single event. It was a long sequence: post-extinction recovery, archosaur radiation, dinosauromorph origins, early dinosaur appearance, climate-driven dispersal, sauropodomorph expansion, theropod persistence, end Triassic extinction, and early Jurassic radiation. Each stage matters. Remove one, and the familiar dinosaur age becomes harder to explain. A simple version of the story says, dinosaurs appeared, then ruled. The rocks say something more interesting. Dinosaurs appeared, remained limited, spread unevenly, endured competition, survived catastrophe, and only then became dominant. That longer version has more room for evidence. It has more room for the animals that came before them. It has more room for contingency, which is where much of evolutionary history actually lives. The old Triassic animals deserve that room. Phytosaurs, Atasaurs, Rauisuchians, Rhynchosaurs, Dicynodonts, Temnospondylus, early crocodilomorphs, pterosaurs, mammaliaforms, and countless smaller creatures were not scenery. They were the world. Dinosaurs rose among them, against them, beside them, and after many of them disappeared. To tell the dinosaur takeover honestly is to let the rivals remain powerful until the evidence takes them away. When the evidence does take them away, it does so without ceremony. A group becomes common in one set of rocks and absent in the next. A tooth type no longer appears. A skull shape vanishes from river deposits. Armor plates stop turning up in familiar layers. Then, dinosaur bones become more abundant. The absence of one lineage and the expansion of another can be as dramatic as any scene of pursuit, because it shows a change no single animal could have witnessed. The final result was a planet prepared for the classic dinosaur age. Not prepared in the sense of purpose, but in the sense of conditions. Competitors reduced. Dinosaur lineages established. Continental systems shifting. Plant communities available. Predatory and herbivorous branches ready to radiate. The Triassic had assembled the ingredients, then broken the old structure that kept them contained. From that point forward, the dinosaur story would become larger, more varied, and more familiar. But the Triassic remains the deeper explanation. It is the difficult chapter where dominance was earned without being visible, where survival mattered more than spectacle, where a small animal crossing mud could belong to a future larger than anything around it. The print in the red stone is still quiet. Its maker is still unnamed. Around it, the mud cracks hold the shape of heat, and the ripple marks hold the memory of water. Nothing in the print announces empire. It only shows that an animal passed this way, upright and light-footed, while Pangaea was still whole enough to carry its descendants outward, long after the river changed course, long after the rift opened, long after the old archosaurs vanished from the land. The pressure of that foot remained. A small mark from a small animal, held through the collapse of worlds. Before the giants, before the famous bones, before the full age of dinosaurs, there was this, a step in Triassic mud, and a continent waiting to be taken. In the end, the Triassic takeover is not preserved as one grand scene. It is preserved as pressure, mineral, absence, and return. A pressure mark where a foot touched mud. A mineral stain where bone accepted groundwater. An absence where a once common reptile no longer appears. A return where dinosaur fossils become more frequent in younger rock. The story is not loud in the sediment, but it is consistent. Read in order, the layers show a world changing its dominant forms. Early in the Triassic, dinosaurs are not there. Later, their close relatives and first clear members appear. Later still, sauropodomorphs and theropods spread through Pangaea, while other archosaurs remain powerful. At the boundary, many of those rivals disappear. Afterward, dinosaurs expand into the roles that will define the Jurassic and the long Mesozoic. That is the conquest, not a charge, not a battle, not a sudden crown placed on a skull, but a lineage surviving until the world around it made survival into dominance. The first dinosaurs did not need to know what they were beginning. They only needed to live long enough, spread far enough, and leave enough descendants for catastrophe to find them still standing. The mud dries, the flood comes, the print is buried. Above it, more sediment gathers. Above that, another world forms. And somewhere beyond the reach of the animal that made the mark, Pangaea begins to break, the old rulers fade, and the dinosaurs move forward into the age that will carry their name. All that remains is the stone, holding the shape of a step made before the world was divided, before the giants rose, before the takeover had a name. And it is enough. Enough to show that conquest in deep time can begin without grandeur. Enough to show that a lineage may spend millions of years as one presence among many, then become central, because the planet changes around it. Enough to show that Pangaea was not simply crossed by dinosaurs, but tested them, limited them, scattered them, and finally opened before them. The print is small, but the world behind it is immense. Red mud, seasonal water, conifer shade, rival reptiles, volcanic fire, extinction, survival, and the first long movement toward the Jurassic all meet in that single mark. A foot touched the ground remembered. And from that remembered pressure, we can follow the dinosaurs as they moved from the edges of the Triassic into the center of the Mesozoic world.